A 35% reduction in risk of all-cause mortality and a 33% reduction in risk of fatal atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is a small benefit.
Well, it also showed a large increase in cancer in the intervention group towards the end of it, right? You don't get to just ignore that.
Welcome to the Proof Podcast, a space for science-based conversation exploring the health and longevity benefits that come with mastering nutrition, physical exercise, mindfulness, recovery, sleep, and alignment. Facts, nuance, and trustworthy recommendations, minus the hyperbole. Hello, my friends. Welcome back. Great to be here with you. I'm your host, Simon Hill. I'm a qualified physiotherapist and nutritionist with an undergraduate science degree and a master's in the science of human nutrition. In my career, I've worked with many people, including elite professional athletes, to improve their health, performance, and longevity. And I'm currently involved in research with a group of nutrition scientists in Australia looking at dietary patterns and mental health. Today, I welcome Dr Matthew Nagra and Dr Goodrich for a conversation or debate on seed oils, specifically omega-6 rich seed oils. So why have this debate? Well, while the guidelines clearly do recommend consuming sources of unsaturated fats, including vegetable and seed oils, instead of saturated fat-rich foods such as butter, there is a very vocal minority that claim omega-6 rich seed oils are harmful, especially for cardiovascular health. While it's true this is a minority position, and many advise me not to host this debate, I'm a firm believer in allowing people to express their ideas and then letting the listeners, you, come to your own conclusion. If someone thinks these omega-6 seed oils are detrimental to health, I want to hear the evidence that they have to support their argument. And I want to hear their positions challenged from someone who is across all of the research. I also want to hear the opposite, someone challenging the consensus. Ultimately, each of us can then come to our own conclusions as to where we land on a particular topic. In this case, on omega-6 rich seed oils, such as sunflower, safflower, corn, peanut, canola, soybean, etc. So that's the background to this conversation and my intention here. As this conversation goes for 4 hours, I'll spare you from a long introduction. Please do enjoy, and I'll catch you on the other side. Hello, gents. Welcome to The Proof.
Glad to be here.
Happy to be here, Simon. Thank you.
Yes, I've been very much looking forward to this one, so I'm glad that we're finally able to sit down together and do it. Today, we have set aside roughly 2 hours for a conversation or debate, whatever you wish to call it, centered on seed oils. I'd like to start here by having the two of you briefly introduce yourselves to those listening, and then before we hear your opening statements, I'll quickly go over the details of the debate so that everyone is clear as to the topic, your positions, and the ins and outs of the way in which this conversation will be conducted or how we intend for it to be conducted as agreed upon by the three of us in the weeks leading up to today. So, Tucker, if you could please kick things off here by introducing yourself to the audience, that would be great.
My name is Dr Goodrich. I'm been called lately an independent researcher of health issues. My professional background was in technology in the finance industry on Wall Street, where I ran some big complicated systems in the financial industry and got sick, and then started trying to figure out what to do about being quite sick. And I won't bore you all with the details of that, but I started using the same tools I used professionally to try and figure out what was going on in my health. And then once I fixed all of those problems, started trying to help other people and popularizing some of the research that I had discovered.
Thank you. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, I'm a naturopathic doctor in Vancouver, BC. I definitely have a big focus on nutrition in my practice, but also outside of that, I just really enjoy researching nutrition, learning more about it. I think it's a fascinating field, and I think that's something all three of us can agree upon for sure. And that's why I decided to reach out to Tucker, and then obviously thanks to you for agreeing to sit down. I know a lot of the times it's easy to just avoid discussing those with opposing views. But I definitely think it's a good way to move forward, right? I'm sure there'll be a lot of things that we agree upon, and there's obviously a few things we disagree upon, and just looking to learn a bit here, and then hopefully share my perspective as well.
Okay, great. So I'll go through a quick bit of housekeeping here to run through the agreed upon terms of this conversation and the debate topic, along with your positions, and then we can get into things. So it's been agreed that this will be an open conversational style debate, that you will avoid talking over one another. This makes it for an easier listen for those tuning in, that you will answer questions directly, so no changing topics or avoiding answering when a simple question is asked, that you will give the other person a chance to respond as opposed to rambling and making several consecutive claims at once, that there will be no personal insults, and I think this is a really important one, and I don't expect that we will see any with either of you from what I know, but we're here to discuss science and address arguments, claims, etc., so please no ad hominem attacks. And as the moderator, my job is to stay impartial and ensure that these agreed upon guidelines are maintained throughout the conversation to the best of my ability. If someone is not adhering to these guidelines, then I will step in to get things back on track. But my hope is that the both of you make this easy for me, and I have little, if anything, to say. In addition to this, we have allowed 2 hours for this conversation. If we get to the end and both of you think we need more time, then we can decide then and there, and if we want to continue on. We've also set aside 5 minutes each for opening statements, and then we will try and keep it to roughly 3 to 4 minutes each, going back and forth to allow each other time to respond before moving to other claims. There's not going to be a timer there, so that will be up to me to make a discretionary call on. And finally, there will be an opportunity at the end for a 2-minute closing statement from each of you. How does that all sound to both of you? Are there any objections or comments before we move to the debate topic and your respective positions?
Just thank you, Simon, for volunteering to moderate this.
Yeah, that's another thing. We should definitely thank Simon for those listening. We had a hard time scheduling everything, and Simon kind of jumped in when we figured out dates that worked for Tucker and I, but we couldn't figure out a date that worked for a moderator. So yeah, thanks, Simon, for hopping on it.
My pleasure. I think we need more of these conversations, so I'm happy to do it. Okay, so let's move to the debate topic. The debate topic that has been agreed upon is, it is more reasonable to believe that seed oils are beneficial rather than harmful for coronary heart disease risk. I'll read that out again. It is more reasonable to believe that seed oils are beneficial rather than harmful for coronary heart disease risk. And Tucker's position is that he disagrees with that statement. Matt's position is that he agrees with it. And to be super clear, we have defined seed oils as oils made from seeds, not the fleshy part of the fruit. So this would exclude olive, palm, avocado, or coconut oils. So seed oils refers to oils such as canola, soybean, sunflower, etc. Gents, is there any objections here?
Nope.
Just to note, high linoleic is really what we're talking about, since there are some newer varieties of oils that have been reformulated.
Sure. Matt, you're happy with that?
I mean, sure, yeah. No issue with that.
Okay. It's also worth noting for the listeners that all references that Tucker and Matt will be referring to in this conversation have been provided to one another ahead of time. The references were first provided on March 8th, and then they had an opportunity to review them and provide extra references to assist with their rebuttal by March 18th, which was 5 days prior to today's recording. I think there was a little delay on the second set of references, but overall, they both did a really good job in a limited amount of time to share their references, which will no doubt make for a more productive conversation than just flying blind. Okay, cool. Well, let's move into the opening statements. I believe, Matt, you're going to kick things off, and then we'll hear from Tucker.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen first, and then I can get started.
And just as a reminder, I will be timing these so we can try and stick closely to the 5 minutes.
Okay, so just start anytime?
Sure.
I guess, yeah. So, I just wanted to start with this meta-analysis on polyunsaturated fat, specifically replacing saturated fat, done by Hooper in 2020. And they found that increasing polyunsaturated fat in place of saturated fat reduced risk of cardiovascular events, and there was a non-statistically significant reduction in coronary heart disease events as well. Of course, these were all randomized controlled trials. Similarly, the American Heart Association Presidential Advisory Paper on Dietary Fats, which specifically chose trials that were not confounded by trans fats, at least not to a large degree, had sustained adherence for at least 2 years, and proved adherence by measuring biomarkers of intake. And they also found that there was a reduction in risk when replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats. Now, I understand there might be some questions or concerns around the FINISH trial, but even if we remove that, as I've shown here on the bottom, it's still a statistically significant result. Moving over to this one, and this was actually a reference that Tucker had cited, but I thought some of the results here were interesting. If we look at the results for heart attack, whether fatal or non-fatal, we see a borderline statistically significant reduction in risk with higher omega-6 intake. And this is largely coming in the form of linoleic acid again. And if we add in the Oslo Diet Heart trial, as I have on the bottom here, it is statistically significant. Now, without it, we can leave it out. It's still moving in that direction. And the reason that they excluded it in the first place was because omega-3 intake went up to a degree as well. But one trial I think that deserves specific mention is the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study. So this was a double-blind, randomized controlled trial where participants were randomized to one dining hall or another, and half of them were getting standard fare, essentially higher saturated animal fat diet, and the other group were having foods that were meant to mimic the standard fare but were higher in linoleic acid and low in saturated fat. So they'd take like defatted milk and fill it with vegetable oil and try to mimic the texture, taste, and all of that that way. And ultimately, we see a reduction in risk of fatal atherosclerotic events in the experimental group, and specifically see benefit amongst those with high cholesterol at baseline. So these would be the people who would be more likely to benefit from reducing their cholesterol levels. So it does make sense. And moving out of the randomized trials into observational research, we see consistency there too. So this meta-analysis of prospective cohorts found that increasing linoleic acid intake was associated with a lower risk of coronary heart disease events and mortality. And they also performed an analysis where they looked at replacement of either saturated fat or carbohydrates, and similarly, linoleic acid came out on top for those as well. And moving outside of looking at polyunsaturated fats or linoleic acid, if we look at actual oil consumption, replacing 1 tablespoon of butter a day from this large prospective cohort with canola oil was associated with a 7% lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. And we actually saw a non-statistically significant reduction with corn oil as well, around 4% reduction. So we're seeing a lot of consistency amongst the different types of studies and markers there. And another way to look at vegetable oil intake is to look at biomarker levels. So if you look at tissue levels of, say, linoleic acid, it can be a proxy for long-term intake. And we see that overall, higher tissue levels of linoleic acid are associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease, and again, a non-statistically significant reduction in total coronary heart disease risk. And this is similar to what we see with what's called Mendelian randomization. So these are people with genetically elevated or genetically higher versus genetically lower linoleic acid intakes over the course of their lifetime, levels, not intake, over the course of their lifetime, and higher linoleic acid, again, associated with a lower risk of coronary artery disease. And the reason I present that sort of data is I'm looking at the data that makes up the top of the evidence hierarchy here, what would typically be considered the highest quality sorts of data, looking at biomarkers or intake, and we see them all pointing in the same direction. And I have no doubt that both Tucker and I are going to have evidence to back up each of our claims, but we're going to have to look at whose evidence is more applicable to the question that we're asking, and better able to answer the question that we're asking, and that is, what effect do seed oils have on our coronary heart disease risk? And I think that's about it for my intro. I know I sped through that, but hard in 5 minutes.
Yeah, you got there just in time, but thank you for that. So let's hand the baton over to Tucker.
Okay, let me just get my timer up. Unfortunately, I have a few more slides. So, if I'll probably put this up on my blog if anybody wants to come back and try and catch up on what I'm going over here. Just bear with me.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get into the details and stuff throughout anyway. This is just a quick kind of intro, so how I look at it anyway.
Right. But that's a good point that there will be links in the show notes to any resources from both Tucker and Matt.
It is more reasonable to believe that seed oils are beneficial rather than harmful for coronary heart disease risk. I disagree with this. And I will note that I usually refer to it as CVD, so it basically works out to the same thing. At current rates, this is a new disease, and it's important to note that this is a study from 1948 looking at the increase of heart disease in the United States. They found a rapid increase across all states that they looked at. Another study looking at a rapid increase in coronary cardiovascular disease in the UK. Again, rapid increase in cardiovascular disease. And this is an intensive look at three populations: white Americans, Japanese people living in Japan and America, and African Americans living in, and then versus Africans. And what they found was that the latter two populations had high rates of heart disease relatively versus very low rates in their native populations. This is important because it was a test of, is this a genetic disease or is it an environmental disease? And their conclusion was that, especially, for instance, in Japanese Americans, where they saw a rapid increase in heart disease in people who moved to the United States, that it was clearly an environmental disease and not a genetic disease. There we go. So what changed during this time? This is strictly looking at the United States. We see a rapid decrease in the consumption of animal fats and an increase in things like shortening and margarine. Specifically, soybean oil and canola oil, along with various other seed oils, saw a rapid increase over the course of the 20th century in the United States and then later around the world. This led to a rapid increase in linoleic acid during the course of the 20th century. The change in soybean oil consumption in the United States, according to the study, was about 1,000-fold and was far and away the biggest change in the food environment in the United States over that period. 7-country study, which was a seminal observational study conducted from 1958 to 1995, looked at some of these populations, including the Japanese, and found, interestingly, that the best explanation was the oxidizability of LDL particles. It was not LDL per se, because what they found was a wide discrepancy between LDL levels in different populations and the cardiovascular diseases in those different populations. So they had to find something else to explain it, and they figured it was probably diet, things like smoking. Specifically, they talked about oxidized LDL, and they noted that what causes LDL to oxidize is polyunsaturated fatty acids. In 1979, it was found that LDL does not cause the first step of atherosclerosis. It's only modified LDL. In 1989, they determined that it was specifically the peroxidation of polyunsaturated fatty acids in the lipids, and specifically linoleic acid, which was breaking down in LDL and turning the LDL toxic. Now, human RCTs on fats and cardiovascular disease, there are actually only 3 that specifically look at an increase in linoleic acid. All 3 of them showed harm. The 3 that showed a bit of benefit did a blended intervention of omega-6 and omega-3 fats. And the latter 2 that showed a larger benefit included longer chain omega-3 fats, mostly from fish oil. The best that one can say about these results from Hooper 2018 is low quality evidence that increased intake of omega-6 fats may make little or no difference to all-cause mortality or cardiovascular disease events. 1 means no effect for a risk ratio. Now, this is after they inappropriately excluded the largest trial, which showed harm. That's the Minnesota coronary experiment.
Tucker,
Only one study.
I might just interject to let you know it's nearly at 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. I've got a timer in front of me. Only one study lowered linoleic acid and increased LA. They showed a 70% reduction in events. And today, oxidized LDL is the explanation for cardiovascular disease. This is from a 2020 consensus statement from the European Atherosclerosis Society. And this is a recent paper from Harvard University looking at the benefits of olive oil and finding that it's less susceptibility to oxidation, which of course, the fat susceptible to oxidation is linoleic acid. And that is it. And then maybe we'll go over these later, but that's my conclusion, is that there is no valid data showing benefit in human, only harms, and it's been addressed repeatedly in human RCTs. The pathway to harm from linoleic acid is not credibly disputed in experimental evidence.
Okay. Do you mind
Sorry
then
for going a little over there?
Yeah,
That's fine.
All good. Now, is this like open conversation part, I guess, at this point?
Yeah, so this is the open conversation part.
Hold
So
on, let me get back to the screen.
Yeah.
Oh, you stopped sharing for me.
No, yeah.
This is
Okay.
just to remind you guys here. So this is just back and forth conversational. We'll try and keep it to 3 or 4 minutes. Give each other time to respond and try not to make too many claims all in one sort of stream.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, so Tucker, if you don't mind, yeah, go ahead. Oh yeah, I just have a couple questions for you just to better understand how you came to those conclusions. So I'm wondering, are you able to describe for me the epistemic framework that you employ to arrive at your conclusions?
I read the papers. What do you do?
Well, no, so that's not, obviously I do that too, but what I mean is, how do you evaluate the research? How do you evaluate what is better able to inform our opinion on these matters versus other? Because obviously we can throw research back and forth. I'm just trying to get what it is that your framework is.
Clearly the highest level of evidence that we have are human interventions, right?
I agree.
Some of the papers that you showed confounded different variables, right? Okay. Which has been common in research in this area. So for instance, the Oslo study increased linoleic acid, but it also increased omega-3 fats, specifically via fish oil, or I think it was also fish in that intervention. Mm-hmm. So what one has to look at is a consistent pattern of evidence across a body of research, try and figure out what the confounders are, and then draw your conclusion.
So that's just kind of what I was wondering. And I definitely want to talk about a lot of these individual trials. But the other thing I'm interested in, I'll give you my answer as well. But what would you need to see to change your view on this topic?
I would like to see some. I'd like to see some evidence.
Like any evidence? I mean, there has to be
high quality evidence.
Yeah, and
I mean, as I was getting into, we've got a lot of epidemiological data. A lot of it's based on really poor evidence, and a lot of it's not evidence at all. We've got the Nurses' Health Study, which claims to show benefit from this, and it's a completely basic garbage data set, as I went over in those 2 slides that I skimmed at the end. They're claiming that they discarded any FFQs where the range of calories consumed was implausible. And they define plausibility on the low side as 800 calories for men or 600 calories for women over a 30-year study. So that's an implausible data set. And unfortunately, they included data that was clearly erroneous and not something that people could survive on, and it calls the entire body of evidence into question.
Okay.
The NHANES study shows the exact same thing. The level of implausible data included in the NHANES epidemiological study is from 50 to 80%. Now, that's not saying it's accurate. That's just saying, that's not saying the remainder is accurate. That's just saying it's plausible. So if we're going to start looking at data that at its face is, absurd, then we shouldn't spend much time on it, right?
Okay.
People can't live on 800 calories a day for 30 years or 600 calories a day. 801 calories a day and 601 calories a day for men and women, respectively, over the course of 30 years. And with data problems like that, there's no way to correct for that, right? They claim that they adjust for it. They claim that they toss the data out. But data errors like that shows that they have a fundamental process error, and that calls every piece of data in their data set into question. So their conclusions can't be relied upon.
Okay. So yeah, I agree that there are going to be, whether it be even implausible intakes or there are going to be outliers within the data set, 100% agree with that. What we're looking at with epidemiology, though, is we're looking at, are those who, based on, food frequency questionnaires, they eat the most of X, Y, and Z and less of other things, do they tend to aggregate in that group versus those in, the lowest quartile or quintile or whatever it happens to be? And the same goes for other exposures, like other potential confounders. We're essentially just trying to tease out, on average, is that what we see in the highest intake group? Now,
but you can't do that if you don't know what their intake is.
And what I want to point out, and if I can just share my screen here, what I want to point out is that we have multiple analyses actually looking at the concordance rate between epidemiology and randomized controlled trial data. So if it is the case that nutritional epidemiology is completely bunk, doesn't reflect or it doesn't actually translate to outcomes whatsoever, but we have this comparison of over 950 randomized controlled trials, over 750 cohorts, assessing 97 diet disease outcomes, or if we limit to meta-analyses, 83 diet disease outcomes. And they're concordant in 69% of the cases. Clearly, it's right a lot more often than it's wrong. And similarly,
what that shows us is that it's always wrong.
What do you mean?
I mean, I looked over a couple of your studies. For starters, the data specifically for linoleic acid was, first off, they never validate it against actual data, right?
What do you mean?
They're never going and measuring what people take every day, say in a ward where they're measuring their food, right? The most that they do is take FFQs and then say, okay, we're doing some statistical legerdemain on the data to try and show that it's internally consistent, but they're never actually correlating it to real world intakes, right? They're not measuring people's foods and then correlating that to food frequency questionnaires. I mean, the NHANES doesn't do that. The Harvard data set doesn't do that. The EPIC data set doesn't do that. The Pure data set doesn't do that, right? They are taking their starting point is a questionnaire. Now,
but
if I
think this is a tangent. This is irrelevant to what I was saying.
This is crucial because if we can't rely on the data, we can't rely on their conclusions.
But that's not. I'm not talking about the methodologies used in the epidemiology. What I'm talking about is the results that we get from epidemiology that are using these methods that you're saying don't work. They actually are concordant with the results we see from randomized controlled trials the majority of the time. That is what this says. And it's not the only analysis. I think that is really key. This is one analysis. Over 950 trials, over 750 cohorts. We have another analysis. This one was somewhat less. It was like 40-something diet disease outcomes, hundreds of cohorts in randomized controlled trials. I can't remember the exact number there. Then we have another one from Morthy, 34 associations. Again, 2/3 of the time, the results are concordant. And so this is even, let's say.
Yes, but unfortunately, the fact that they're concordant 2/3 of the time doesn't tell you anything about whether a specific study is going to, a specific epidemiological study is going to be validated in an RCT. And in this specific case, we have 3 RCTs that shows harm. So it's really irrelevant what the epidemiology says because we have the actual studies.
Well, no. So would you agree then, based on that, and we'll get to specific outcomes in a second here, but would you agree that the majority of the time, randomized controlled trials nutritional epidemiology produces results that are concordant with randomized controlled trials?
It's irrelevant.
No, but that's that. Can you just answer the question?
You're going off on a tangent.
It's not. I'm talking about the quality of. If you agree that randomized controlled trials are the highest tier of evidence, as you said, human intervention trials, and epidemiology is concordant most of the time with randomized controlled trials. Like, all I'm asking is, do you agree with that statement?
It's an irrelevant statement.
That it's just
I'm not
a question.
going to go down this tangent.
I mean, I don't. We agreed that we would answer questions.
Yeah, relevant questions. We also agreed we wouldn't go off on tangents, and going off on, I think it's fair to observe that epidemiology is unreliable and often produces unreliable outcomes. I mean,
but that's not what I'm asking here, Tucker. If we look at linoleic acid specifically, if you want to highlight that specific marker here, linoleic acid, cardiovascular mortality, concordant between RCTs and epi, right there. So if you want to say that, we're not looking at the specific exposure of interest, we're seeing it right here in this paper. So again, I'll just ask.
But you're looking at studies here. I mean, they mentioned the Hooper paper. The Hooper paper incorrectly excluded the biggest linoleic acid RCT. So it's garbage data.
So we'll talk. I plan to talk about MCE, but again, my question is, and this is, I think, the 3rd or 4th time, is, do you agree, based on the data, the 3 analyses I just shared, and there's actually a 4th, but it was I figured it was too late to share it by the time I came across it. There are 3 analyses here, all showing that the majority of the time, nutritional epidemiology is concordant with the randomized controlled trial data. Do you agree with that? Is that just a simple yes or no?
No, I don't.
You don't? Well, then why do we see a 69% concordance consistently? Roughly, give or take a few percent, depending on the analysis.
Because it's just a meta-analysis without going through and auditing the thing.
But you had 2 weeks to.
Nobody could audit this in 2 weeks.
Well, no, I mean, we're just talking about linoleic acid, really. You could have highlighted that if you wanted to.
And if we look at the high-quality data that we have, the human RCTs, we see harm consistently. So at that point, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the hierarchy of evidence you showed puts observational studies below RCTs.
Yeah.
The way the scientific process works is that you do an observational study, and then if you find an interesting outcome, you attempt to confirm it with experiments. Yeah. And that's exactly what's happened in this field of research, right? And even the study that I produced, Hooper 2018, that you agreed was a valid study, says they show no benefit. And that's no benefit after they exclude the bulk of the data.
We'll get to that. Again, I absolutely plan to address those. But the fact of the matter is, on the whole, now, if you don't have an objection to the methodologies used here, I mean, in a debate setting, I think
I've already said that I have an objection to the methodologies used here. You're looking at observational studies.
No, that's not actually what it's not. It has nothing to do. I'm not talking even one bit about.
You're talking about the concordance between observational studies and experimental studies.
Exactly. Yes, and I'm just asking
the fact that there's an overall statistical number of correlation based on this study doesn't tell you anything about a result in a given field.
Sure, I
So it's
agree.
irrelevant.
No, it's not irrelevant. I'm just asking if the majority of the time we're looking at 87, if we look at the meta-analyses, or 90, or sorry,
So-
83 or 97 diet disease outcomes. So many different exposures. In 69% of those cases, we're seeing concordance.
So what?
So my point
We're
is,
not discussing we're not discussing those cases. We're discussing one topic here.
I understand
So
that.
let's focus our discussion on this particular topic.
No, but the problem is that you were essentially saying that nutritional epidemiology as a whole is not trustworthy, and you're carrying that over to the discussion of linoleic acid or vegetable oils.
Well, I'm looking at the data that specifically pertains to linoleic acid. Yes, I don't think it's trustworthy.
Okay, that's I plan
what
to get
we're
to
discussing today. So let's
absolutely
stick with that.
Well, I don't want to drag you in, Simon, but do you think it's a fair question?
I think it's a reasonable question, but I also do understand Tucker's position here, and I tend to think that where this is headed is towards your disagreement as to what the randomized controlled trials are showing and not showing. But I think you've made your point, Matt, and I think it's probably best that we can just move forward. Okay. Otherwise, we're going to end up spending 20 minutes on similar sort of things going in circles and not really get anywhere.
Okay. Yeah, so then, Tucker, I mean, if Minnesota, that's the one that you believe to be the best, the one that they erroneously left out in the Hooper analysis, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it would be a good one to discuss then if it's kind of the top tier for you. So I'm just wondering, what do you think about the dropout rate or the attrition rate in this trial?
I think they had turnover.
Yeah.
They also had on average, the mean intervention period in this study was the longest of any of the big studies. I think 68% of the people who've been in any one of these studies were in this particular study. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at the vast majority of data that we have in this topic is in this particular study. So excluding it for an arbitrary and invalid reason, as Hooper did, is, definitely an invalid adjustment, I think.
Okay. So I mean, based on their own power calculations, I've got here down at the right. This isn't something arbitrary. This is their own calculation. They require between 2,490 to 11,645 participants to obtain a 5-year significant difference, and they needed a follow-up of at least 3.6 years. At the end of the trial, they had 2,000, or in this more recent analysis anyway, they had 2,355 participants, and they had 2.9 years average follow-up. So do you did they satisfy their own power calculations?
That's sort of irrelevant, really, right? When you're doing an RCT, if you show harm, as they did in this one and as they've done in the other two, you don't get to discount it because you don't meet a p-value.
No, I'm not discounting it for that reason. I want to be very clear. I'm not. It's just it's one of the
but it's a
issues.
Statistical test. It's rather irrelevant to the outcomes.
Yeah. But I think it's not really relevant because the results are actually compatible with there being potentially a reduction in risk as well. It's still compatible with that being the case based on what we saw.
Mortality tended to go up.
Yeah, sure.
So that's not a reduction of risk.
Sure, but it's still compatible. It's still compatible with reduction.
You talked about the Dayton study, the LA veterans.
Yeah.
What was the final outcome of that study?
So can we talk about that after this one? I'm more than happy to. Absolutely. But can we just stay on topic for now?
We are on topic. I've been letting you sort of go along with this for quite some time.
But I have a
what was the result? You said that Dayton showed benefit. The LA veteran study showed benefit. Mm-hmm. What was the final result between the control group and the experimental group?
Well, it depends on which outcome you're looking at. For fatal atherosclerotic events, there's a reduction.
And what was the total outcome?
Oh, so
All-cause mortality.
I see where you're going. So I absolutely plan to address that, but I don't want to get off of the
Well,
Minnesota
let's get into it.
topic.
Let's get into it now.
But we were just on. We can't just jump around like that. Like, let's systematically. Let's cover MCE right now, and then 100% the next thing we cover is LA veterans. Absolutely, totally fine with that. But let's first go into this particular study. As you said, it's the best study you have. I'm saying LA veterans is the best one. Yeah, sure. But I believe you said highest quality. But regardless,
no.
Okay. If it's the biggest anyway, let's just go over that, given that we're here, and I will absolutely talk about LA veterans right after. Okay, is that fair?
Sure.
Okay. So for one, we talked about the power calculation didn't satisfy it. We can argue around how important that is. But if we look at the original publication here, we see the lion's share of the events actually occurred within those first couple of years, especially the first year, as we see on this table on the left. Now, if we confine the results to people who remained on the diet for at least 2 years, we actually see a trend towards benefit in the highest risk group, the older age group, in the treatment group. As far as acute heart attack, sudden death, silent heart attack, 0 for men, 6 in the treatment group, 6 for men in the control group. For women, we have 1 versus 4. Same with all deaths, we see a trend. Now, none of these are statistically significant, but again, if you're not concerned with that, and if you think that the trends really matter, when we specifically look at people who remained on the diet for at least 2 years and had good adherence, and we look at the highest risk group, we actually see benefit from the treatment, right? Rather than just pulling them all together.
What are you doing here? You're doing a post hoc analysis. Well, first off,
this is the original.
If the total finding.
Well, no. Look, if you're taking people who were going to be dying or having a heart attack in the next few months and put them on an intervention, nothing's necessarily going to save them in that case. This is from this isn't like some analysis I've done myself. This is from the original paper for the Minnesota Coronary Survey, which is where the MCE data came from.
Right, and they found a total harm.
We're not talking about that. We're talking about coronary heart disease.
That's the relevant outcome
to the debate on coronary heart disease.
Absolutely.
And even if we look at all-cause deaths,
if you have an intervention that like what happens in LA veterans, where they showed a bit of a benefit for coronary disease, but more people died in the intervention group because they got cancer. Well, personally, I would rather die of a heart attack than die of cancer.
And we'll get to that.
Rather, side effects are very significant in studies like this. Okay. And you can't claim a subset of the data shows that the intervention is positive, for instance, because in Hooper, they show a tiny benefit for heart attack, but no benefit at all for mortality. Well, that's not good.
Well, no. But we're talking about, the debate is specifically about heart disease. And even if we look at all-cause deaths here, and we look at the higher age group, again, we see a trend towards benefit in the treatment group versus. So even if I grant that in this debate we should at all focus on all-cause deaths, we still see a benefit in the treatment group compared to the control group. Do you agree with that in the higher age group for people who've actually been on the diet for an extended period of time?
You're doing a subpopulation analysis. If we look at the total outcome, we see harm.
So, okay, but we're not talking about that here. I'm talking about for those who were. So do you agree that if we were to see harm, so if we were going to see harm from this intervention, we would more likely see it with people who've been on the diet longer than those who had it for a shorter period of time?
Frankly, it's irrelevant to me.
Why is that? So it's irrelevant. So if I were to go and... So
you're saying if you die in the short term, but if you survive the long term, it's a beneficial intervention?
No, not necessarily.
Who would take that pill? Well, that's the argument that you're making.
Well, no, I'm saying if I can just clarify, answer that question. If we're talking
I'd like to share something for a moment.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you see this?
Yep.
Yeah.
Here we go. So again, the complete data, MCE does cross 0. There are some people who get a benefit from it. But ultimately, they're showing harm. The hazard ratio is over 1.
But that's not what I was talking about. I was asking specifically.
I know, but you're missing the point here, right? The point is not, does a subgroup show benefit?
But so for starters, we're talking about coronary heart disease, in which this is cardiovascular that you're showing. I agree with that. Okay, that's fine. But would you agree that if something was going to show harm, you would likely see it in those, like, are these people immune to the problem? So are you saying that people who remained on the diet longer somehow received benefit because they're immune to the harms in some way? I mean, they did better than the control.
Well, there's known genetic variation in how people handle omega-6 fats. So it's plausible that the people who are, just like there are smokers who die in fairly short order when they start smoking, just because Castro lived to 101 or whatever smoking cigars doesn't mean that cigars are a beneficial intervention.
So you're just so I'm clear. Yeah, just so I'm clear. So you're saying that those who remained on the diet longer were able to do so because they somehow conferred benefit from the linoleic acid based on some genetic predisposition? Because they did. It wasn't just.
They were less susceptible to the harm, just like Castro and his cigars.
But no, they did better than the controls. It's not that they were less susceptible to the harm. Percentage-wise, they did better than the controls who were also on the intervention for a length of time. We have 14% of the women having, in the control group, 14% of the women having MI or sudden death, 16% of the men, or 17% of the men, versus 0% of the men in the treatment group who were on the diet for that period of time, and 3.8%.
You're still left with an intervention that overall showed harm.
No, you're not. You're the control group.
That's what the data shows. That's what we're looking at here. It's the top line.
That's not. We're talking about long-term
hazard ratio not well over 1, but over 1.
But that's
indicates that the entire intervention had harm.
But that's not what I'm asking. Right? You said that those. No, I just want to make this really clear. So you said that those who were on the diet for longer might have had some sort of genetic predisposition to prevent harm from linoleic acid. Is that much correct so far?
It's a possible explanation.
It's a possible explanation. But it wasn't just that they didn't experience harm. They did better. They experienced benefit, if anything. That is what I'm trying to understand. Do you have an explanation for that?
No, I don't. But so what? It's irrelevant.
Well, it's not irrelevant. So you're saying that there's some people...
Because you don't know, when you put somebody on an intervention, you don't know whether, if you put somebody on if I tell you to start smoking tomorrow, do we know if you're going to get lung cancer in 20 years or never get lung cancer and live to 100 and whatever? No, we have no idea. So looking at a statistical outcome post hoc, right? I mean, this is like the most rudimentary fallacy of study analysis. When you're an individual looking at the intervention, you decide not to smoke, I presume, because you know that on average it's harmful.
So you're saying that...
Well, you know what? These people don't seem to be okay, right? The French have lower rates of heart disease from smoking than Americans, so it's probably okay to smoke.
Okay, so are you saying that the people in the treatment group here that were on it for a longer period of time were actually consuming less vegetable oil than the people in the control group, or less linoleic acid than the people in the control group because they believed it to be harmful one way or another?
No, the data is quite clear that they were consuming more.
Well, yeah.
Right?
So
variation in outcomes from an intervention is typical.
Okay.
Right? They all have variations. That's why we have all these little error bars on here and confidence intervals. Not everybody has the same outcome.
Yeah, but again, like I just don't understand what the explanation is here for them doing better. Like, can you just please try to clarify that?
I think I've clarified it. Now, the problem that I have with some of the papers that you're looking at, or some of the arguments that you've made, is that you're showing, for instance, you cite we agreed that we were going to discuss the effect of seed oil, specifically linoleic acid, right? Mm-hmm. It's been demonstrated, as these studies show, that there are different effects of omega-6 fats, linoleic acid, and short chain and long chain omega-3 fats, right? Alpha linolenic acid and DHA and EPA. Why are you blending those two different types of studies to make your argument? I mean,
what do you mean?
Well, if we go back to some of your slides, you're saying, oh, look, the Oslo Diet Heart Study showed benefit. Well, the Oslo Diet Heart Study was not a study of linoleic acid. The Oslo Diet Heart Study was a mixed intervention of linoleic acid and fats from fish.
Yeah, and so so I'm understanding you believe that the EPA DHA confer benefit compared to the linoleic acid.
That's what the data seems to show.
Okay. I just want to be and look, if that's the case, like I agree that EPA DHA are also likely beneficial. Like I absolutely.
Well, good.
Yeah. So I think
so
we
for
agree
instance, the SACS 2017 American Heart Association Presidential Advisory did the same thing that you're doing. They combined a bunch of studies that showed benefit like Oslo, and their conclusion was something that was not supported by the study. So you can't take the Oslo Diet Heart Study and conclude that based on that intervention, that an intervention consisting solely of seed oils is beneficial.
It was polyunsaturated. They were replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, and EPA and DHA are polyunsaturated fats. That's what they were looking at there. But
it's not linoleic acid.
There is
no DHA and EPA in any seed oil.
Sure. And that's, I'm just saying that I don't think SACS misrepresented that because they were specifically looking at a PUFA for SFA replacement, right? Which is accurate to what they did. Right?
Actually, they turned around and they recommended increased consumption of omega-6 PUFA based on a study that had a blended intervention that didn't support their recommendation.
Can you show me that?
It's in the paper.
Like they refer specifically to Oslo Diet.
Ramsden wrote an objection letter, which I don't have in front of me, and actually didn't cite, so I'm not going to go into that.
Okay. And going back to Ramsden for a sec too, the last issue I just wanted to raise with MCE before we move on to LA veterans, as if you still want to go there, I think that was the agreement, was that there is the potential for confounding due to trans fats as well. If we look at the predicted change in cholesterol versus the observed change was less than the predicted, which could be explained by inclusion of trans fats. And there were only 3 margarines that were really widely available at the time, and 2 of those 3 did contain trans fats as well. So it's also a possible issue there, which is one of the reasons
Nobody knows the composition of those fats.
No, that's what I'm saying.
You're misrepresenting it, right?
No.
Additionally, we have a biomarker, as Ramsden has pointed out. We have a biomarker that allows us to distinguish between the effects of trans fats and linoleic acid in these studies. It's LDL. Trans fats cause LDL to go up. Linoleic acid causes it to go down. All of these studies showed a decrease in cholesterol from linoleic acid consumption. So if you're going to claim that the outcome was confounded by trans fat consumption, which we can't test because we don't actually have any samples of any of the fats that were included at the time, if it was such a significant effect, we should see it in the LDL outcomes, and we don't. We do. We don't. We see a reduction, which is the effect that we get from linoleic acid, not an increase, which is the effect that we get from trans fats.
Can I share my screen? I just want to show you the figure for the table for their LDL reductions.
While you're doing that, Matt, just to clarify, I brought up the SACS paper. It does say at the end, overall evidence supports the conclusion of polyunsaturated fat, mainly from vegetable oils, mainly omega-6 linoleic acid. So that is in their summary.
And I mean, if they're saying, if they're not saying specifically, if they're saying mainly, I think that is still compatible. But that being said, I can see that, they did specify omega-6 fats. I have no issue with that. But do you mind if I just share my screen real quick here, Tucker?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Go ahead.
Okay. So talking about trans fats or in the change in LDL, I agree that the LDL still went down, total serum cholesterol still went down, but it didn't decrease as much as we would expect based on Key's equation. And so that could be because trans fats were preventing it from dropping as low as it could have. It's not the case that trans fat consumption was so high that it completely blunted the LDL reducing effects, but it could be the case that trans fats were preventing the reduction that we otherwise would have seen.
You're speculating.
Well, sure, and I admit I am speculating. I'm saying it could be a plausible explanation.
We could also observe that heat causes trans fat production in any cooking oil.
Yeah, but not to a huge degree.
Cooking oils, when they're cooked, start producing trans fat. So any cooking oil intervention, unless you use uncooked cooking oils, which none of these studies did, is going to have some amount of trans fats. That's just that's a fundamental problem.
And do you think that like a oil with 1% trans fat would be just as bad as an oil with like 15% trans fat?
I don't think they had 15% trans fat, and I haven't seen any data that looks at trying to. One of the problems with this whole field is that there is no data trying to decouple the effects of trans fats and linoleic acid.
Well, sure, but that's not really what I'm asking. So if, let's say, it was 15% trans fat, would you think that is potentially worse than a 1% trans fat?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. So you think that trans fats and linoleic acid are roughly equivalently bad? Or
the animal data that I've seen shows that linoleic acid is worse than trans fats, and the fact that trans fats are saturated and not susceptible to oxidation makes them less harmful than linoleic acid. So I would actually expect to see a better outcome from a study that had higher amounts of saturated and trans fats than completely linoleic acid.
Okay. So
based on the animal data.
So just to clarify, then you think that replacing linoleic acid, if someone were to replace vegetable oils with something that is lower linoleic acid but high in trans fats, would probably be a net benefit.
Possibly.
Okay.
I've never seen a study that's done that, but it's based on the animal data, it would be consistent.
Okay. And now I'm more than happy to jump into LA veterans if you want. I know you mentioned a couple things about like all-cause mortality or cancer. I believe you mentioned cancer outcomes, something along those lines, right?
Right.
Yeah. So actually, do you mind explaining a bit about that? Just for those listening so that they can, I can give you the screen as well if you want it, and then we can jump into that.
So deaths due to non-atherosclerotic causes numbered 71 in the controlled group and 85 in the experimental group, right? Most of the difference occurred in the latter part of the study. Consideration of causes of death in this category suggests that this difference probably did not, they say, reflect a toxic effect of the experimental diet, although as they noted in other papers, there is data suggesting that increased consumption of PUFA can contribute to cancer outcomes.
So cancer specific. Okay, yeah. Let's talk about the.
But that starts getting very off topic.
Well, no. I think it's relevant. Well, if you're suggesting that as I mentioned, like fatal atherosclerotic events and other cardiac outcomes, they did better, especially those with higher cholesterol at baseline. Are you suggesting that that's because they were dying of other causes?
Well, I'm suggesting that any intervention that results in a higher all-cause mortality is not an intervention I would like to take, regardless of what I die of.
Wait, where is the all-cause death finding that you're speaking about?
Can I ask one of you just to share your screen, perhaps, with this study?
Oh, yeah. Tucker, do you want to? You can point out to me what that all-cause finding is.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Dayton did show a bit of a benefit.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I just wanted to, I was really confused. Okay. So yeah, then what would your objection be otherwise?
Dayton again was linoleic acid plus a blended intervention. The blended interventions
blended
all
in what
showed
way?
It. Beg your pardon?
Blended in what way? Like what do you mean by blended? Because as far as I'm aware, is pretty much exclusively vegetable oils being infused into these various foods.
a blended intervention of linoleic acid and of omega-6 and omega-3 fats.
Yeah, but omega-3s from where?
From vegetable oils.
Yeah, so the debates on vegetable oils, I think the fact that they contain some ALA, like soybean oil, for example, doesn't mean that it's all of a sudden irrelevant to what we're talking about, unless you hold the position that soybean oil is healthy on the net.
I don't hold that position.
Yeah, so it shouldn't matter then if there's some ALA in there, right?
Well, the problem that we have with ALA and with omega-3 is that they both seem to show benefit, but they show more benefit in a context of a lower linoleic acid diet, which gets us back to the one diet we have here that showed a very significant improvement, which was the here. Let me.
Yeah, Lyon diet hard. I know you're talking about that. But right. Again, just to clarify though, I want to understand your position on LA veterans, right? I want to clarify your position on LA veterans first before we move on to Lyon diet. Just because, so if they showed a benefit with oils like soybean and other similar oils that, yeah, they contain some ALA, but they're high in linoleic acid, would you agree that that is overall beneficial?
That's what the studies show.
Yeah, so you agree that the vegetable oils used in LA veterans were beneficial then for the the outcomes of interest?
Slightly beneficial, yes.
Okay, cool. And by slightly, like, can you quantify that? I'm just wondering what you mean by it, because the way I look at it.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Here's the quantification.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we see, again, 3 high linoleic acid studies showing harm. As I said in my introduction, 3 blended studies showing slight benefit. One of them didn't show any benefit. And then we have 2 studies showing a more benefit from a higher intake of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. This is what the evidence shows us.
But with LA veterans, I'm confused as to what outcome specifically that was. Because if we look at, I could always share my screen too, but if we look at, say, aggregate of ischemic heart disease, acute MI, and acute cerebral infarction, we have a 36% reduction in risk, and it's statistically significant. For fatal atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, 0.67. So yeah, again, a 33% reduction in risk, statistically significant. For all-cause mortality, again, 35% reduction in risk, all statistically significant. These are substantial. So I'm just wondering, what outcome was chosen for this figure here?
What outcome was chosen for this figure?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense based on the data that I have here.
So what's your point here, Matt?
Well, no. So my point is, I don't know what outcome that is, but when I'm looking at, ischemic heart disease, acute MI, and cerebral infarction as a combined endpoint, substantial reduction in risk. Fatal atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, substantial reduction in risk. All-cause mortality, substantial reduction in risk. To say that there's just a slight benefit, non-statistically significant benefit based on this figure, I'm just wondering, what is that looking at? Because it's not actually concordant with what I'm seeing here, and I can share my screen and go over this stuff too, no problem. From the LA Veterans paper itself.
So I'm looking at Ramsden's meta-analysis from 2016. Mm-hmm. Which I presume you're familiar with.
Yeah. I think you sent that one yesterday, but I'm just wondering what, I understand where it's from. I recognize it, but I'm wondering what outcome is specifically on that figure there from the LA Veterans paper.
So the baseline and control diets in the LA Veterans study were rich in hydrogenated oils, so we can assume had a good amount of trans fats.
No, I will absolutely not agree with that, and I'll explain why here in a second.
I'm curious to hear that because pretty much by definition, trans fats are produced in the process of hydrogenating oils.
Yeah, so I'll just share my screen. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So this was from the USDA data I sent. Oh, it's loading. Just give me a moment. There you go. Is it just in table form? Table form essentially. Top left here. Now this is kind of an extreme example of a 34% trans fat. If we use like miracle margarine from back in the 60s, it'd be like 15% or so. But if you look at no hydrogenation versus fully hydrogenated, it's like 1%. It's not a huge amount by any means. And even if we were to cut this the partially hydrogenated in half, it's like orders of magnitude higher. As far as trans fat content. If we look at the top right, that is more of your standard, in the red there, more of the standard partially hydrogenated soybean oil, around, I think, 14-15% trans fats, as we see here, versus, again, the really super high one. But yeah, we don't actually see a huge amount of trans fats in fully hydrogenated oils or shortenings. But I do want to go back to...
Although, if you have a fully hydrogenated fat source, a study like this, you're not doing a linoleic acid trial.
Well, no. That's not in the intervention. That's in the control. The intervention group had vegetable oils basically infused into foods to mimic the
Fills.
standard fare. And actually, what's really cool about this is they did a pilot study first. Like, no trials do this nowadays, but they did a pilot study where they trialed these food replacements to see that if, are they, do they taste good? Can people recognize them? Just making sure that they really did mimic and that they were palatable to the people consuming them. So they went above and beyond, and it was specifically vegetable oils that were infused. And that's the earlier. I have these later in my notes too. I want to pull it up right here. And if we look at, if we look at total, where is it? Total, all-cause mortality, we see a benefit there. And this is simply taken from the paper itself, just put into a forest plot, so it's easy to read. For ischemic heart disease, acute MI, not statistically significant. But if we add cerebral infarction, so stroke to that, substantial benefit, 0.64. For fatal atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, 0.33. For all-cause mortality, 0.65. Or sorry, I meant 0.67, meaning a 33% reduction, and 0.65, so 35% reduction. So we do see a pretty consistent reduction risk of these cardiac events across the board.
Right. So Dayton says, we did not analyze our diets or tissue lipids for trans fatty acids. Presumably both diets contain some trans fatty acids from partially hydrogenated fats, but such fats were only minor components of both diets.
Yeah.
So it wasn't the controlled diet.
Well, so both. I mean, I know that in the controlled diet,
therefore, as they say, the cholesterol elevating and triglyceride elevating effects of unnatural fatty acids cannot have been an important factor in this trial. Yeah,
I would agree with that.
Cannot or can be?
Cannot.
Yeah,
so I agree with that. And I mean, they measured adipose linoleic acid concentrations, a pretty marked increase, like 3-4 times increase over the course of the trial there. A substantial drop in serum cholesterol levels, body weight stayed about the same. There's a reason I think that this is probably the best that we have. But according to these results, would you not take the position that for cardiovascular outcomes, it was absolutely beneficial to have vegetable oils in the place of saturated fats?
It showed a small benefit, a very small benefit.
A 35% reduction in risk of all-cause mortality and a 33% reduction in risk of fatal atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is a small benefit?
Well, it also showed a large increase in cancer in the intervention group towards the end of it, right?
So that's
you don't get to just ignore that.
Okay. So I will get to that in a sec, but do you agree for the cardiovascular outcomes there is benefit and substantial benefit at that?
I don't agree that you can just slice and dice a study like that without some consideration over the right.
So let's go to cancer then. If we look at the adherence level, cancer outcomes stratified by levels of adherence to the diet, the lion's share of the cancer death in the experimental group were in people who did not adhere. 0 to 10% adherence. They write this in the paper. Many of the cancer deaths in the experimental group were among those who did not adhere closely to the diet. This reduces the possibility that the feeding of polyunsaturated oils was responsible for the excess carcinoma mortality observed in the experimental group. However, there were significant...
the possibility.
I'm going to continue.
Doesn't rule it out.
I'm going to continue. However, there were significantly more low adherers in the entire experimental group than in the controls. In both groups, the number of cancer deaths amongst the various adherent strata are compatible with random distribution. A high incidence of high adherers would be expected if some constituent of the experimental diet were contributing to cancer fatality. So if the intervention was causing cancer outcomes, we would see a higher rate in those who are actually following the diet. And they measured diet adherence with tissue linoleic acid concentrations, so we know whether or not they were adherent. We can't say that the intervention caused the cancer outcomes here, and it's very, very, very unlikely that that's the case. So, with that being said...
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I don't agree that it's... we can say that with the certainty that you're saying it.
Well, I'm saying
they
it's
had
very,
enough
very,
uncertainty
very
about it so that they wrote several subsequent papers looking at the effect of cancer on this intervention.
Well, and we see cancer in those who didn't follow the diet. I mean, it's as simple as that. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible that there was a slight, maybe it's possible there's a slight increase, but guess what? It's possible that there was a slight decrease too, based on the higher adherence numbers here. We don't know. We can speculate that away, but at the end of the day, if I go back, even for all-cause mortality, despite having higher cancer deaths, we still see a reduction in all-cause mortality, and a substantial one at that, 35% reduction.
Yes, a slight increase, which suggests that there is a benefit to omega-3 fat supplementation.
No, they were predominantly linoleic acid, and you know what? That aside, whether it's due to...
But I mean, that's a crucial distinction.
It's
right?
not.
Because
it's not because
in the American diet, what we see is a massive intake of linoleic acid and a tiny intake. I mean, we're looking at a ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 of like 20 to 1, which is way outside any sort of evolutionary norm, right?
Okay, so are you talking about...
Can I interject here, guys?
Yeah.
Because this has come up quite a few times, and I think it would be important to clarify here, because from my end, it seems like what Tucker's saying is some of these trials are confounded by the inclusion of DHA, EPA, or ALA.
Yeah.
I think it would be important to potentially establish, if Tucker has a view on how much of that would confound. And then perhaps that will help clarify some of this.
Sure.
As in how much of those fats would need to be in a diet.
That's an excellent question. And unfortunately, the answer there is not clear because the benefit of those fats seems to depend on the intake of linoleic acid, which in the case of alpha-linolenic acid, the short-chain omega-3 fatty acid, the benefit seems to come from the long-chain fatty acids, as the chart that I showed indicates, right? So the benefit of short-chain fatty acids depends on conversion to the long-chain fatty acids, and that is blocked in humans by high intake of linoleic acid. So a given rate of alpha-linolenic, a given rate of the short-chain omega-3 fatty acids may be beneficial in some circumstances and less beneficial in other circumstances, depending on how much conversion is done to the fats that the body actually needs.
Okay.
Right? Additionally, long-chain fatty acids, reduction of omega-6 fats in the diet increases the lipid pool of long-chain fatty acids through a mechanism that's not yet been determined. So a lot of it depends, getting outside scope of this conversation. Other studies have shown, in fact, I think I included one of those, have shown that just lowering linoleic acid increases omega-3 fats in serum. And I've never seen an explanation of why that happens. So it depends a lot on the different components of the diet.
And just to backtrack on to where we were before that too. The one thing that I think we need to clarify here is I agree that linoleic acid in particular is a proxy for vegetable oil intake, and it's a large component of vegetable oils. we have to remember that this debate is centered on the vegetable oils or seed oils, as we call them, itself. And so if this intervention, LA Veterans, is using things like soybean oil as a really major component, there's safflower, soybean, cottonseed, they're all listed on the left side here by my arrow, a corn as well. Are you suggesting that because this intervention also increased ALA by increasing consumption of these oils, that those oils are healthy, as this study suggests?
I wouldn't suggest that any of them are healthy. I mean, we have to remember, we're looking at a background of a population that has what seem to be extremely high rates of cardiovascular disease based on historical and geographic distribution of the disease, right? Mm-hmm. So saying that a relatively small benefit, I mean, what I want to know, the question I want to know is, why were those Africans in Lee 1964 showing a near zero rate of myocardial infarction? Mm-hmm. And why were African Americans showing 12% myocardial infarction, mm-hmm. right? Yep. So if you're going to tell me that going from 12% to 10% shows that these are healthy, I'm going to disagree. If you're going to tell me that going from 24% to 10% shows that they're healthy, I'm going to disagree. Because
I don't know what you're talking about with those percents. Can you just clarify for me? I'm just not following.
Sure. Let me go back to this. This paper. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. So these numbers are evidence of previous heart attack at autopsy, right? For the audience, a heart attack leaves permanent damage in the heart, and you can tell at autopsy whether or not a person has ever had a heart attack, a myocardial infarction, right? So and again, this is an old paper. In white Americans, 24% of the people had evidence of a heart attack. In Africans in Africa, 0.1% had evidence of a heart attack at autopsy, right? 1 out of 4,500 people had evidence. What I want to know is, what's that difference, right? Mm-hmm. Why did Africans go from 0 in Africa to 13% in this study? And why did cardiovascular disease go up so much in the United States and England as seed oils were introduced into the population, right? So you're looking at a background rate of high disease, okay. Right? Yeah. Populations that have low intakes of linoleic acid uniformly have low rates of cardiovascular disease. Uniformly. I'm not aware of a single exception.
Okay. And so with like LA Veterans, then would you say that for the standard American person on a standard American diet, if they were to, and not that that's even necessarily, I guess it's close to what they're having there, but if you
can we all agree that a standard American diet is
absolutely
unhealthy?
100%.
I know you guys have very different attitudes about diet than me, but I think we can all come together on that.
I think we agree on that. But what I'm wondering is, so in a case where people are at high, say, baseline rate of cardiovascular disease, would you take the position, based on these results I've shared, that if people were to replace saturated fat with vegetable oils, they would actually benefit, because that's what this showed?
In general, it's, what did Hooper 2020 say? There's a study that you started off with, little or no benefit.
That was not, well, that was total PUFA, and it was combined amongst a bunch of trials. I think this is the best trial.
So I would expect little or no benefit.
But I'm talking about specifically the LA Veterans trial here, as being the one that's best designed to answer this question. And even if we look at
it's best designed to answer this question.
What, a double-blind randomized trial?
All three of those studies that showed harm from a high linoleic acid intake were replacing saturated fats with PUFAs
and trans fats. Not rose corn.
We don't know about the trans fats.
NC most likely, but there are other issues there we've already gone over. Now, I mean, I think I've kind of made my point with LA Veterans. So let's talk about this data that you just presented here anyway. You said that was Lee, right? Yeah, I think I have it here. One sec. So do you have the paper there? If not, I can share one of the tables I wanted to just mention really quick.
Go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I think these results, as far as low MI, I want to say first off, I absolutely agree that environment is a huge factor. I think that we absolutely agree on. What factors amongst those environmental factors, I think that's where our disagreement is. But if we look at, for example, Uganda here, look at the number of autopsies in the 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49 group versus those in the upper end here. We see that most of these people are dying at a very, very young age. They wouldn't even make it to the ages where we'd expect to see heart attack. And at the same time, that really incites potential for survivorship bias. And so for those listening who might not know what that is, basically those who survive through, especially if you look at, say, hunter-gatherer populations and everything too, those who survive through childhood, don't fall victim to things like infant mortality or infectious disease, they are likely the fittest of the population. They're the ones who are less likely to develop a lot of these issues moving forward. So, oftentimes I see people argue that we should look at specifically, data that is adjusted for infant mortality, so post-infant mortality, but I think that actually skews the data in a more favorable direction for that population. Whereas if we look at New Orleans here, we see very low death rates in the younger population and more in or at least total numbers here in the lower population and more in the higher population. And yeah, they're more susceptible to MI. Of course, that is not just the only issue. There are many other environmental factors that are at play, whether that be dietary or otherwise. I absolutely agree. But I don't think that looking at these ecological associations like this that don't adjust for any confounding variables whatsoever really tell us that seed oils are all of a sudden the problem.
Well, I'm not claiming that this tells us anything about seed oils.
I just want to make sure. Yeah.
I'm claiming, it indicates that is a factor that was different at that time between specifically Japan and the United States.
Sure,
right?
I could agree with that. Yeah, I could agree
with
that.
The point of this and the previous two studies that I showed in this was to indicate that cardiovascular disease is not an expected human disease in the prevalence that it exists nowadays.
Okay, yeah. No, I think we fully agree on that anyway.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think that's any point of contention. Now, you mentioned Lyon diet heart a bunch. Do you want to maybe talk about that at this point? You said that's probably the strongest one that you got. Yeah, you talked about Lyon diet heart a lot, the trial.
Well, Lyon, do you want to? Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, go ahead. You can. It was your reference. Go ahead. You can talk about the main.
So Lyon diet heart is the strongest heart disease prevention trial of any intervention that I'm aware of. Right. And they unfortunately it gets excluded from a lot of these analyses because they did a whole bunch of things. They told them to eat less saturated fat, but interestingly, it's the only intervention done where they specifically decreased the linoleic acid intake in the diet. And they specifically went against the Ansel Keys's hypothesis that an increased polyunsaturated to saturated fat ratio would be beneficial. That study increased it, right? And they saw a massive decrease. Now, this was a secondary prevention trial, so they're looking at people who've already had a heart attack, who are obviously most likely to have another heart attack. And they saw, I think it's a 70% reduction in mortality.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So if one's claiming that linoleic acid, an increase of linoleic acid is going to be beneficial for cardiovascular disease, one has to explain, A, why did cardiovascular disease in the United States go up as consumption of it went up in the early part of the 20th century? But also, why does the one trial that reduces it show the biggest benefit of any of these trials?
Okay. Yeah, and so here I'll talk about Lyon a little bit. So I think you've already mentioned one thing, is there were a lot of moving parts, right? I think we agree there that it wasn't just messy. One thing, right? Yeah, so just so that those listening or watching can get it, basically, there was a difference in bread intake increased, legumes went up, fruits increased, meat decreased. Butter and cream decreased. Margarine went up. So we see there's definitely multiple. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll also note that if one looks at all the different foods that changed in most of these interventions, there's typically a lot of things going on. In this, particularly the control, which was a really poor control, they were apparently consuming some version of the AHA prudent cardiovascular diet, although the AHA is disputed exactly what version of it they were eating. So, which is also a low saturated fat diet pattern.
Okay. So they also provide their nutrient intake data. Now, I made this table just to make it a little prettier so people can follow along. And so just want to talk about a few of the moving parts here. For one, we see that in the control group, saturated fat intake was 11.7% of calories, and in the intervention, 8.3% of calories. That in and of itself, as we see in the top left here from the Hooper 2020 paper, crosses that threshold where we expect to see benefit or a harm if you're increasing intake. When you go from about 8% of calories up to 10+% of calories, I mean, it's a striking increase in risk of cardiovascular disease. So moving the opposite direction, it's not super surprising that we see a benefit. And this is based on the randomized trials as well. Similarly, as you mentioned, with linoleic acid in the pink here, or the dark or light purple, whatever you want to call it, going from 12.6 grams in the control to 7.7 grams in the intervention, about a 4.9 gram difference. They did reduce linoleic acid, absolutely. I mean, you look at LA veterans, they increased from 10 grams up to something crazy like 30 some odd grams or 40 grams. So it's a striking increase, yet they saw benefit. So I'm not sure how this, unless that little bit of increase of ALA somehow countered all of that and led to benefit. But we see...
Well, they didn't see a benefit like this study saw a benefit.
Yeah, sure. But they did see a benefit with a massive increase in linoleic acid intake, so which is confirmed with biomarker measures too. If we look at ALA, this is an interesting one. You go from 0.6 grams up to 1.8 grams. Now, if we look at this dose response analysis, we see that going from about 0.6 grams to about 1.8 grams will lead to about a 25 to 30% reduction in risk of coronary heart disease mortality. So this isn't events, this is actually mortality. And so it is entirely possible that based on those findings that the benefits are actually driven by a reduction in saturated fat and an increase in ALA, despite reducing linoleic acid. There's no way for us to... Yeah, go ahead.
No, continue. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's absolutely possible that the benefits are driven by changes in saturated fat and ALA, but not linoleic acid. And actually, for all we know, the benefits could have been even greater had linoleic acid increased. And if we look at the relative changes...
Well, except there are lots of studies that reduced saturated fat and increased linoleic acid, and none of them showed this sort of benefit. So it's unlikely...
You mean like MCE, Sydney, Die, Hart, and Rose?
Yes.
Yeah, and so we've already talked about MCE. I don't know if we need to get into that more, but we can talk about the other two as well. But if we look at the relative changes as well, the relative change in saturated fat in the yellow here, 1.56, in the linoleic acid, 1.63, very similar, and the relative change in ALA is 2.8. I mean, the change is there's no way to isolate these findings to linoleic acid, or even to isolate it to linoleic acid and ALA while ignoring the saturated fat finding. I just don't see how that can really be done.
Well, Delorgeral's explicit rationale for this study was to adjust the PS ratio.
Yeah.
Right. Which so we have a hypothesis. We have the hypothesis that the increased PS ratio, which came from Ansel Keys and was the justification for the AHA recommending a decrease in saturated fat and an increase in polyunsaturated fat in the 1961 AHA dietary guideline paper, would decrease cardiovascular disease rates. And there were two major tests of that hypothesis. Ansel Keys was one of the principal investigators on the MCE. So that was a direct test of his own hypothesis, and we saw an increased harm. And then Delorgeril took that ratio in the other direction and showed a massive benefit. So we do have a test of a hypothesis here.
Sure,
it's not,
but yeah, go ahead.
It's this test of this switch from polyunsaturates, from saturates to polyunsaturates. And we have lots of papers, we can go through Hooper 2018 and Hooper 2020 again. And, what do they find? Little to no effect, maybe a benefit for myocardial infarction only, but small benefits for heart disease, for all-cause mortality or heart disease.
Okay.
And then we have this outlier, which Hooper excludes because it didn't modify dietary fat, I think was the language that they used, despite, as you just noted, they did modify dietary fat.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if that's what they said, then fine. But yeah, I would agree that they did modify dietary fat. I just don't think we can claim that it is at all due to the reduction in linoleic acid that we see these results.
Why not?
Because we do see a reduction in saturated fat as per Hooper. We see the increase in ALA, as I've suggested, would show a benefit across. And I think you agree that ALA and that increase.
So did LA veterans reduce saturated fat and increase ALA?
Yeah, but it also increased linoleic acid. So if linoleic acid was this benefit was due to
which study showed a better result?
This one did, but they're also different study designs altogether. This one is they have different participants altogether. This one is secondary prevention. You're looking at higher risk patients. LA veterans was primary prevention. Completely different sort of event rates that we're going to see. Completely different background.
Right, but I mean, you're looking at a tougher patient population here. These are the people who are most likely to have a bad outcome,
and they're also most likely to benefit from changing.
True. Right.
Yeah.
But we have lots of secondary prevention studies. None of them showed the results of this one.
Sure, but we also have like a whole bunch of secondary analyses from LA veterans too. Like we have, where is it? If you look at specifically those who started at a younger age with higher baseline cholesterol levels. Sure, it's not quite on the level of Lyon diet heart, but we see a pretty substantial benefit there. Same with high age and high cholesterol. If you isolate it to those who are most likely to benefit, that's where we see a bigger benefit. And these patients, as I mentioned, were lower risk to begin with. So I don't think you can just compare the two. I think it's comparing apples to oranges, really. And then
why is it comparing apples to oranges? They're both fat modification studies.
Yeah, but one is looking at people who've had recently had a heart attack, and one is looking at people who never have. Those are completely different sets of participants. And that's aside from the fact that Lyon diet heart changed other things, increasing grain intake, increasing fruit intake, legume intake. There's all sorts of
other things. And we have other studies that have done all those interventions, and none of them have shown this sort of benefit.
Okay, yeah, and I don't dispute that whatsoever. I don't dispute the fact that none of the studies looking at very specific changes that occurred in Lyon diet heart study have shown the benefit that is seen in that study that used all of those interventions together. I absolutely agree with that. I don't really know why we can't just agree that they changed so many different things. And I agree that there is no study that has gone about that has seen a similar reduction in risk by changing one or two individual factors that Lyon diet heart did change.
Right. So then we get back. So then we have to get back to the mechanisms of heart disease, right?
Well, no,
yes.
Can we just clarify?
Sorry,
second.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Can we just clarify, just for the listeners, on that Lyon diet heart study? What Tucker is saying that there was a substantial decrease in linoleic acid, omega-6, in the group that saw benefit. And Matt, your position is that is confounded by other changes that resulted in a drop in saturated fat and an increase in omega-3s. Is that the current position where you both are?
Yeah, I would add that there were also other changes. When I'm talking about the saturated fat and the omega-3s, I'm specifically talking about the changes with fat intake. Because there were other things like as I mentioned, bread, there was a lower intake of meat, there was a higher intake of legumes, and like all these other changes that also took place. Just to clarify.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So are those plausibly going to affect heart disease risk based on what we know about the mechanisms? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I would say so, but
the demonstrated mechanism for cardiovascular disease is a increase in oxidized LDL, which has toxic effects throughout the body, cytotoxic effects. If I can share this. And we have multiple studies going back thousands of studies going back several decades looking at that pathway. Right. So to evaluate what mechanism in a study like that is going to be effective, one's got to look at the mechanisms, right? So at this point in 2022, as far as I'm aware, the only explanation on the table for what causes cardiovascular disease to initiate and progress is what they call the oxidative stress model or the oxidation model, where LDL becomes oxidized and initiates atherosclerosis and causes every step of it to progress, right? That's why this Harvard olive oil paper that just came out that I think you included, Matt, and I may have also, I don't remember. They are claiming the benefit of olive oil is because of it being less susceptible to oxidation. And this takes us all the way back to 1989 and Steinberg and Whitstam's paper showing that what happens to LDL to cause it to become toxic is the oxidation of the omega-6 fats in it. So if we look at Lyon, Lyon heart in light of that, then the effect is quite obvious, right? What's driving this is oxidized omega-6 fats exclusively, because those are the bulk. 90% of the polyunsaturated fats in LDL are omega-6 fats. And literally the definition of oxidized LDL is an LDL particle with oxidized omega-6 fats. That's the test that's used for them, right? There are actually several different tests, and they all look at that factor. So to simply say, oh, it could be any of these things is to ignore the demonstrated mechanisms of how this progresses, right? And to argue that, alpha-linolenic acid we see in these models is much less atherogenic because it doesn't turn into the same toxins that omega-6 fats turn into. So it's perfectly consistent that the 3-linoleic acid only studies that we see would cause the worst damage. The one where we see it reduced causes the most beneficial effect, and that fats that have a tendency to block the effects of omega-6 fat in the body, like ALA and DHA and EPA, would all show more benefit than an LA-only intervention, taking us back to another paper that we both agree is important, Boren et al., the European Atherosclerosis Society. Their step one in the initiation of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is the oxidation of lipids, right? That's what kicks off the whole process. So we can go back and forth on all of these antique studies, but the simple fact is there's no other explanation that's on offer in the scientific literature for cardiovascular disease initiation and progression. There's nothing else.
Okay. Is it okay for me to comment?
Shoot.
At this point? Yeah. Do you mind if I can share my screen too? And just while you're doing that,
go ahead.
just curious, where does that oxidation occur? Like in the
well, there are a couple of different hypotheses about where it occurs.
Do you have one that you prefer?
I go with the postprandial hypothesis, where it starts in the gut and it is oxidized as it goes through the lymphatic system and into the blood.
Okay. So And now you mentioned Steinberg, and then what was the second author?
Whitston.
Okay, so I just want to go over those really quick here. Okay, so this is from Steinberg. Yeah, Steinberg, 1989. Can you see the screen, by the way?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So they suggest that these newer findings about the properties of oxidized LDL, together with the information available from experimental pathology and cell biology of the macrophage, make it possible to propose a hypothesis about the development of the fatty streak lesion that is based solely on the presence of elevated plasma LDL levels plus the oxidative modification of LDL within the artery wall. I agree with that, but the oxidation occurs within the artery wall, according to this paper. You have native LDL in circulation.
No. That was a hypothesis.
Okay.
That was not a fact as you presented it.
Okay. Yeah. According to their hypothesis anyway, or one of their hypotheses. And so they kind of describe, and we'll get to another figure in a minute here, but they kind of describe how native LDL enters the subendothelial space, becomes oxidatively modified, engulfed by macrophages, becomes a foam cell, eventually goes on to form a fatty streak, and so on. They also suggest that for several reasons, it seems that the oxidation of LDL probably occurs not in the circulation, but within the artery wall. And first, even if oxidized LDL were generated in the plasma, it would be swept up within minutes by the liver. Second, oxidation is inhibited by plasma and so probably requires the favorable conditions of a sequestered microenvironment. Now, they go through an analogy. I'm not going to bother with that, but at the end they say, the LDL molecule in the subendothelial space may find itself from time to time trapped in a space between cells where antioxidant levels are low. So it seems that once you have elevated plasma LDL, you have more LDL moving into the subendothelial space, and then we get retention there that leads to oxidation. And I'm going to cover why that happens. So going to Whitston, which you also cited, they do mention increasing plasma cholesterol associated with higher risk of atherosclerosis and so on. They also mention that we have reason that significant degrees of oxidative modification of LDL do not take place in the plasma because of its high antioxidant content. Again, similar to what I just mentioned. But this is the real, big quote on the left side here. Thus, we now can understand how hyperlipoproteinemia could of itself be a sufficient basis for initiating the atherosclerotic process in all its manifestations. So this is from the paper that you're citing. And they do go on to suggest, as far as the ox-LDL kind of hypothesis, that ultimately a clinical test of this hypothesis in man will be needed to demonstrate that inhibition of oxidation of LDL will inhibit the atherogenic process. So just going back, they themselves state, from the reference that you cited here, we now can understand how hyperlipoproteinemia could of itself be a sufficient basis for initiating the atherosclerotic process in all its manifestations.
Which is the genetic hypothesis for cardiovascular disease, which Lee disproved way back in 1964.
That paper was later on. This one, it was 91. So were they just not aware?
Lee, 1964, the geographic progression of cardiovascular disease, ischemic cardiovascular disease. If you're claiming that LDL per se causes cardiovascular disease, then what you are claiming is that cardiovascular disease is a genetic disease because we all have LDL based on our genes. Yeah. And if that is the case, you would not have wildly variant rates of cardiovascular disease in genetically similar populations in different environments. Okay. So we knew back in the 1960s that the LDL causation hypothesis was false, right? What these guys added was showing specifically not only these gentlemen, but also Brown and Goldstein showed was specifically what element was required to turn a non-atherogenic LDL particle into an atherogenic LDL particle. It had to be modified. It had to be modified by having the omega-6 fats in it oxidized. Now, they went on beyond that to say, okay, if you have more LDL and it gets oxidized, that may be an additional factor on top of the oxidation. But they're quite clear that this is a required step, right? Brown and Goldstein's experiment showed that the initial step of atherosclerosis, the conversion of a macrophage, or what they posited as the initial step of atherosclerosis, the conversion of a macrophage into a foam cell, doesn't happen with native LDL.
Sure, they find that it doesn't engulf. The difference is that, and I don't understand exactly what you're saying as far as it being a genetic disease. Are you saying that genetics are what determine LDL concentration, or can you just clarify what you mean when you say?
Of course,
yeah.
Genetic LDL ApoB is a product of the ApoB gene, right? Mm-hmm. If ApoB, again for the audience, I presume everybody knows this, is the protein that carries fats and cholesterol around the body. It goes through a couple of different stages, and one of those stages is LDL. ApoB can become oxidized if it has omega-6 fats in it. And, but ApoB per se is not atherogenic, right? That's what Brown and Goldstein's experiment demonstrated. So
why? Because macrophages didn't engulf native LDL. That's why.
That's right.
Okay, so I'll explain why that. And actually, the other thing I just want to clarify then, based on the studies cited in those previous couple that we just discussed, they pretty clearly state how oxidation doesn't happen in the plasma, or at least not to any significant degree. Do you take issue with that?
Irrelevant where it happens. The fact is that it happens. I mean, look. We know that it happens in the plasma because it's detected in the plasma, right? When you go get an ox LDL test, they are not sticking a needle in the endothelium in the inside of your artery. They are taking a blood test. So we know there is oxidized LDL. We have interventions that can adjust the rate of ox LDL in your serum. So yes, I agree. This paper from 1991 has a hypothesis about what is happening, but all these decades later, when you can go to your doctor and get an ox LDL test, we know that it's in the plasma. There's no question. That's not even.
I agree. I agree that ox LDL is in the plasma, but why does that mean that it was oxidized in the plasma? Why couldn't it have been oxidized in the subendothelial space and then spilled out into the plasma?
Why is that relevant?
No, I'm just saying because if you're claiming that it's oxidized, and it's because I'm going to talk about the kind of mechanism of action here, and if you're saying that it's oxidized in the plasma specifically, I don't think you've actually suggested or shown data to support that.
Why is that relevant?
It's relevant because, I'll explain what my kind of position on this is, and then we can talk about why it may be relevant. Okay. So this is that boron paper that you cited. Now, you cited figure 3, I believe, or figure 4. This is the first figure, or actually second figure after the chart that they give. This shows that as you have elevated LDL concentration, which I know you mentioned genetics. I mean, I think we both agree that you can modify LDL concentration by diet as well, right? I don't think we have any agreement there. Yeah. So as you have a higher LDL concentration, it enters the subendothelial space by transcytosis, and once it's there, there's proteoglycan binding that happens. So ApoB can bind to proteoglycans, and that's where it aggregates. Once it's held there and retained in the subendothelial space, oxidation is almost inevitable. It's just a matter of how long it takes for that to happen.
Well, we know it's not inevitable.
So you have data showing that you can completely 100% prevent the oxidation of LDL once it's retained in the subendothelial space.
Well, we have data that show, multiple human studies that show that the composition of fats in LDL determines how susceptible it is to oxidation.
Sure, but that's not what I'm asking. Right. I'm saying you're saying that it's not.
But that is what you're asking. No. That is what you're asking because if you have LDL that has, let's say, an evolutionarily appropriate level of omega-6 fats, that it is going to be much less susceptible to oxidation than something that is very high in omega-6 fats. And it's been demonstrated repeatedly that is controlled by dietary intake of omega-6 fats, the susceptibility of LDL to oxidation.
Well, no, so just if you don't mind, I'm going to go through a couple slides here really quick. Then happy to hear your response. I just want to be able to get off a couple points here really quick. Is that okay?
Fire away.
Yeah, okay. So basically my approach to this would be, you have the elevated concentration, enters, there's retention of the LDL, oxidation, whether it happens sooner or later, to what degree, sure, we can debate, argue that, but it seems like pretty well inevitable, and we might have disagreements there. And this is where they talk about oxidative susceptibility, right? All LDL particles exert atherogenicity to variable degrees, which can be influenced by the proteome, lipidome, proteoglycan binding, and eventually oxidative susceptibility. Now, if we look at the specific reference for that, they actually don't hold this view for omega-6 fats, even though it may be shown to be to increase susceptibility to in vitro oxidation. They seem to ultimately protect against coronary heart disease. Now, we've talked about the trials. Obviously, there's some disagreements there, and that's fine. I just wanted to point that out. But I think the real key point to this comes from this claim on the left side. Genetic alteration of either the proteoglycan binding domain of ApoB or ApoB binding domain of arterial wall proteoglycans greatly reduces atherogenesis. So if you affect the ability of the LDL particle to bind to proteoglycans, you can greatly reduce atherogenesis right there. And this is the study that they're citing. So what they did was they took mice with different types of LDL. So some were defective in LDL receptor binding, some had defects in proteoglycan binding, some were normal, some had defects in both. And they actually found that those that had normal LDL receptor binding, but defects in proteoglycan binding had significantly less development and a much lower trajectory as far as atherosclerosis development. So they made it pretty clear that atherosclerosis is initiated by subendothelial retention of atherogenic lipoproteins. But they actually went further. They verified that the differences in atherogenicity were due to the affinities for proteoglycans and not due to oxidation. So they actually took the different types of LDL, whether it be the defective LDL or the control LDL, they performed copper-stimulated oxidation, and there were just no differences in the ability to oxidize. So it seems that the atherosclerosis development here was driven by proteoglycan binding, not by oxidation.
Well,
and so,
that's not their first. When they go through the steps of atherosclerosis, the first step that they list is the oxidation of the fats in the LDL.
No, they don't. It's right here. The
Yes.
LDL particles influx. No, the oxidation happens once it's in the subendothelial space. It's laid out right here. The figure that you're taking is looking at, I believe, extracellular and intracellular space. That's already in here. That's not in the plasma, right? So you have high concentration of LDL in the plasma. It transcytoses, enters the subendothelial space, is retained, and then it goes on to be oxidized, which then initiates the macrophage engulfing it, becoming a foam cell, and so on.
Matt, can you summarize your point and the relevance, and then give Tucker a chance to rebut here? I'm just conscious you've had the mic for a bit.
Yeah, totally. So basically, what I'm saying is that if Tucker is saying that oxidation of LDL is the initiating factor, and I don't disagree that it's involved in the process. My point is that elevated LDL cholesterol levels, or more specifically ApoB, as we both mentioned, leads to LDL particles or ApoB ending up in the subendothelial space, being retained in that subendothelial space, where oxidation is pretty much guaranteed to happen. And this study demonstrates that if you can reduce that proteoglycan binding, if you can reduce the ability of the LDL particles to be retained in the subendothelial space, then you can greatly reduce the development of atherosclerosis, aside from any changes in oxidation. There were no differences in oxidative capacity of the LDL here. So I think it's pretty clear. And one way to reduce the amount of ApoB in the subendothelial space is to reduce LDL or ApoB concentration, which is something that can be done by eating polyunsaturated fats. So that would be kind of a quick summary, I guess, of my points.
Right. I think you're misunderstanding the process of oxidation, right? It is a requirement that you have omega-6 fats for the LDL to become oxidized and have the toxic effects that it's been shown repeatedly to have. It doesn't happen, right? It chemically can't happen. There are two. Okay, when you're looking at an LDL and an oxidized LDL, the process of it converting from an LDL to an oxidized LDL is the conversion of linoleic acid and arachidonic acid, the two primary fats in the body, omega-6 fats in the body, to 4-hydroxynonenal, HNE, and malondialdehyde, MDA, right? The definition of an oxidized LDL. The definition is an LDL with MDA. That's the test that we use, right? Those two aldehydes define an LDL. So if you're claiming that it can happen through some other pathway, it's never been demonstrated anywhere. None of these papers make that claim that I have ever seen, right? If you go and you look at the tests that they do, the E06 antibody test or the 4E6 antibody test that you cited in one of your Harvard papers, they're both looking at MDA and MDA modified proteins on the LDL. There is no other way that it can happen, or at least not known to science at this point.
Okay. And do you agree that some level of linoleic acid is guaranteed to be there, right? Like you're not going to have zero.
Absolutely. Okay. It's a standard part of the immune system to have linoleic acid in LDL.
Okay. So then my question would be, why is this not borne out in the LA veterans trial again, where you go from 10% up to like 40% for at least adipose tissue levels, or actually intake was around that similar kind of ballpark?
Because there's a plateau effect, right? It immediately goes up. It goes up at very low levels, and then additional levels of intake make no difference.
So where would that threshold happen? What percent of calories, if you had to kind of give a rough estimate? Like, is it 10%? Is it 8%? Is it 5%?
If one were to look at Lyon Diet Heart, they reduced it down to 3.8%.
Okay, so.
Right. And most Americans in their diet we were at 5% back in the 50s, and now we're at anywhere from 7 to 20% of our diet is linoleic acid.
Okay.
There are clear threshold effects. I mean, the AHA paper on omega-6 fats doesn't mention it, but they mention it in their paper on omega-3 fats, that there are clear threshold effects of these fats in a variety of different disease situations.
Okay.
So yes, you're not, if you max out LDL composition of linoleic acid, and given the structure of an LDL particle, okay, so a triglyceride has an SN1 position and an SN2 position. The SN1 position is always a saturated fat. The SN2 position is always an unsaturated fat. It can be oleic acid, or it can be linoleic acid, or any other polyunsaturated fat. Most likely, it's kind of irrelevant. But that fat is what makes that fat in that position in the triglycerides and in the phospholipids of the LDL are what make it susceptible or not to oxidation. There is no other way that it can happen.
Okay. And so just again, to clarify on the threshold effect, and so you're saying like Lyon would be the kind of the one
that indicates
at, right?
That indicates to me that they're getting it down below the threshold, and they're, through the combination of omega-6 fats that don't convert, HNE and MDA are HNE is only produced from omega-6 fats. MDA can be produced from omega-3 fats or omega-6 fats. In the LDL, which is primarily omega-6 fats, most of the MDA is coming from the omega-6 fats, because that's what's there. Okay.
And so if Lyon went from 3.8, I think you said 3.8%
down to 3.8.
Oh, down to 3 from like 5.3 or something, or 5.5, or
I don't believe that they did an analysis of the
not from baseline, but from in the control
diet.
group. In the control group anyway. In the control group, I think it was around 5 point or something, right? 5.5, we'll say, just for sake of argument.
Just to clarify, you're talking about the percentage reduction in calories from linoleic acid.
Percentage of calories from linoleic acid, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, and so So that threshold then is going to be somewhere between, at the very least, somewhere between, we'll say roughly 5.5 to 3.8. Right?
Good.
Is that fair?
That would be consistent with the results.
Okay. So I just want to show the Hooper analysis that you cited. If we look at their subgroup analyses, actually, when you start below 5% of calories and you increase omega-6 intake from there, you see, again, now it wasn't quite statistically significant, but a 0.77 there, reduction in risk of CHD events. And for cardiovascular mortality, it's a 30% reduction, and it was statistically significant.
Cherry picking.
How's that cherry picking? It's the one analysis that crosses the threshold that you just cited. Right? It's the only study included here according to your threshold that is capable of answering the question.
I can't even see what study you're talking about. You've pulled a table out of a
Matt, can you
huge paper.
Can you bring that study back up from the beginning and just summarize your position here a little more clearly?
Yeah. So this was the paper that I talked about earlier that Tucker had cited as well. And, I was just trying to get an idea of what the threshold was, because I knew that this paper broke it down by, baseline amounts or comparison group amounts. It was baseline and then increasing from there. And so if we break it down by baseline and we cross the threshold that Tucker is talking about, then we do see an increased risk there, a benefit crossing that exact.
And what page is this table on?
I got it from the website, so it wasn't like by pages. You know what I mean? When you go to the link.
What table is it?
Yeah, so table is, it should be saying there. If you go subgroup by baseline, it should come right up if you just Control F that.
Subgroup by baseline.
Yeah, there are so many analyses. I don't know if they numbered them like that. That would have been useful. My bad.
Subgroup by baseline omega-6?
Yeah. That would be the one.
While Tucker's doing that, Matt, can you just explain why this threshold is important in case listeners are a little bit lost, because we've been bouncing around a lot?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I'm actually not super convinced that there is a threshold at this specific value. I'm sure there is a threshold to which we no longer see benefit. Of course, I think it goes in the opposite direction that Tucker does. I think increasing is beneficial versus harmful. But the reason I wanted to know that is that if there are certain situations where we see the opposite effect or we don't see an effect according to what either Tucker or I might expect to see, I want to know why that is. And Tucker was suggesting that is because at a certain point of linoleic acid intake, you no longer you no longer experience harm. So I was just trying to find out where is that threshold, and it just happens to be that when you do cross that threshold, according to, again, this meta that he had cited, we actually see a benefit there. And this is more specific to, this is going to be more specific to omega-6 intake versus a multifactorial intervention like the Lyon diet heart study.
Yeah, sorry, I am jumping.
Yeah, I can see if I can grab it on the PDF. I prepared this a while back, and I might be able to direct you towards a specific page.
Are you getting to a point here, right? We have multiple studies, which I've linked, showing that oxidation of LDL is controlled by the fatty acid composition, and that this is controlled in humans by diet, right? So what's your point here?
Well, my point is that when it comes to these mechanisms, there can be multiple things at play. I've highlighted
there are always multiple things at play when we're talking human biology.
Yeah, exactly. And so, we've discussed some of these mechanisms. I thought it was, fair for each of us to present our cases there. But ultimately, what matters in my view is, does eating more seed oil actually lead to higher risk of disease? Right? That's ultimately what we need to look at. We need to look at the outcomes. And, there's a reason for that. When we look at the translation rates of mechanistic research. Yeah, go ahead.
But that's not strictly what we're arguing about here, right? The proposition is it reasonable to think that it's going to be beneficial? Mm-hmm. And my response is that it's not, because it doesn't show when you do a strict high linoleic acid intervention in humans, you show a tendency towards harm, not a benefit, right? And even the papers that you're citing, like Hooper 2020 or Hooper 2018, say that at best there's little to no impact on it, right? Does that make it reasonable to think that having a high consumption of this stuff, when even your own sources say that it's going to have little to no effect?
Well, to be clear, 2018 was your reference, not mine.
Yours was 2020.
Yeah.
Which says the same thing.
Yeah, but when we look at the threshold that you've cited, we see a benefit.
No, I didn't cite a threshold. I speculated that there is a threshold and that would explain the paper. And then you came up with some table that we can't seem to find in this.
Well, I can send you over the PDF. It's the exact same one. It's Hooper 2018, the omega-6 paper.
What page is it on? I've got it right in front of me.
Yeah, so it's page, I was just at it, I think it was 89. Let me just go back up to 89. Yeah, I'm seeing literally exactly that, like exactly what I have on screen on page, at the bottom of page 89 right now.
I'm not, it's going to take quite a while for me to go through and figure out exactly what it is you're looking at this point. I think we should move along.
Okay, but provided. Yeah.
Can I just clarify the positions here, and then we can agree to disagree and move on if that's the case. But
sure.
Matt, what you're saying is that in Lyon diet heart study, there was a significant reduction in, was it cardiovascular events or death?
Yeah, events.
Right.
Death,
and we were talking about that earlier. And in the intervention group, there was a 2 or 3% reduction in linoleic acid. Right, and Tucker takes the position that the benefit in that trial is a result of that reduction in the omega-6s. You said earlier you think it's confounded potentially by saturated fat reduction and an increase in omega-3s. We got to that point. Mm-hmm. Now, you are bringing up a Cochrane review that is suggesting if you take omega-6s, linoleic acid from 0% of calories to 6% of calories.
Less than 5% to above.
Less than 5% to above 5%. That there's a reduction in what?
That was cardiovascular mortality, and then for CHD, it was suggestive of benefit. It wasn't quite statistically significant.
And what study were they? I mean, this is a meta-analysis. What study were they citing for that change?
That one, actually, funny enough, I think was the LA veterans. Going back to that, so the LA veterans actually increased from about 4% of calories up to like something ridiculous like 20% for linoleic acid, or 18% or something along those lines. Yeah, and I can show you if you want to look. I have the table or the figures here in the tables for intake in that trial. If it's easier for me to do that.
Yes, and that's a confounded study with ALA intake as well.
It's not, because the debate is on seed oils. These seed oils that they used, soybean, cottonseed, corn, sunflower, they are the seed oils that we're talking about. If you're saying that those seed oils are confounded by ALA, that they produce a beneficial effect, then you would have to accept that corn
oil has virtually no seed oil. It depends on which seed oil you're looking at. We agreed to talk about high linoleic acid seed oils.
What do you mean?
Right. I mean, on my presentation, I showed, grouped high linoleic acid plus ALA, linoleic acid plus DHA, showing that the harm is specific to the high linoleic acid interventions.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Which unfortunately happens to be what most Americans are eating. So yes, do I think that if Americans reduce their linoleic acid intake and increase their alpha-linolenic acid intake, like in Lyon Diet Heart, would their health improve? Absolutely. Okay. And I'll note that Lyon used a canola, if I remember correctly, or rapeseed oil, which is what they call canola over in Europe, right? But most Americans don't eat that way. Most Americans get very little ALA, which is often taken out of these fats because it oxidizes so fast.
So
the actual diet that we're looking at is closer to the 3 in the United States. What people are eating is closer to the 3 harmful ones.
But what we're talking about, again, we aren't talking about isolated linoleic acid here. We're talking about vegetable oils that are, typically very high in linoleic acid, and some of them might come with a bit of ALA. So if we look on the very far right part of this figure, that's the increase in ALA, and yes, there was an increase. And relative to the benefits we see with ALA, that might be a significant increase. I'm not going to argue that. But look at linoleic acid. It's like 4 times as high. We see palmitic acid decrease, stearic acid cut in half as well. And so, like, essentially what you'd be saying is that this intervention showing benefit by, like, predominantly using soybean oil as far as I'm aware, actually, but soybean, corn, cottonseed, and safflower oil, they saw striking benefit across the board for cardiovascular outcomes and all-cause mortality.
They saw a fairly small effect, not a striking benefit.
So, what is it? You think a 35% reduction in risk in all-cause mortality, a 33% reduction in risk of fatal atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is small?
Let's go back to the meta-analysis.
Which meta? Oh, the one that you've cited. Yeah, and we can talk about those trials. We've already talked about Minnesota. I think we're going to agree to disagree on a few things there. And I do want to talk about Sydney Diet, Heart, and Rose as well. But are you saying, and I just want to, like, a simple yes or no is fine too, but, like, you're saying a 33% reduction in risk of fatal ASCVD or a 35% reduction in risk of all-cause mortality is a small reduction?
We have 3 studies in this group.
That's not my question.
We have DART, LA plus ALA, which showed
That's
HR.
not the question.
Yeah, it is. It is the question, because you can't take one study, right? And I mean, your little chart showed meta-analyses at the top, right?
Yeah.
You can't take one single RCT and prove an effect.
Guys, let's go
which
through
is what
these
you're
trials.
trying to do here.
Let's go through these trials one by one.
One at a time, please.
So Matt, you're presenting the LA Veterans trial.
Yeah.
Give Tucker a chance to say what he thinks wrong with it, and then let Tucker talk about the other trials, and you can bring up any issues that you have with those.
Yeah, and can I just ask the one clarification question I wanted to ask?
Sure.
Let's go. And that was just, I just want to know, in your view, is a 35% reduction in risk in all-cause mortality and a 33% reduction in risk of fatal ASCVD considered a small reduction? That's just what I want to know. Regardless of everything else outside of that, I just want to know the answer to that question.
In cardiovascular disease, yes, it's a small reduction. It's a large relative risk. It is a small reduction in a small absolute risk of death.
Okay.
Right? As I said, what I'm really interested in is why do half of Americans, or whatever the number is nowadays, die of cardiovascular disease when apparently the number in a traditional society is far, far lower, right? So yes, that's a small reduction because most of those people are still going to die of cardiovascular disease.
But they didn't here. Like, that's the thing that I don't like. I don't.
Most people in the United States. Sorry, correct me if I'm wrong here, but isn't cardiovascular disease still the leading cause of death in the United States?
It is, yeah, absolutely.
And if you reduce that by 33%, say, is that going? Where's it going to be? It's going to go from what, number 1 to number 3? That's still a huge death rate.
Oh, for sure. I'm not saying that it isn't. I'm just saying that a single intervention, like, remember, a single intervention of just replacing saturated fat with vegetable oils, saturated fat rich foods with vegetable oils, leads to that much of a reduction, ignoring all of the other changes.
No, it doesn't. Because based on your study, Hooper 2020, it has little to no effect.
Yes, and we can talk about
based on your meta-analysis, the data from the top of the pyramid that you presented, it has little to no effect. Hooper 2018, looking specifically at omega-6 fats, also says that it has little to no effect. So, Matt, you seem to do a thing here where you're cherry-picking data out of your pyramid, to try and make a point. And when you see one number in a study, you glom onto it and say, oh, look, this proves my case. And yet you ignore your other references and you ignore the hierarchy of evidence that you provided so that you can try and score a point, right?
Well, no.
Your paper, Hooper 2020, shows that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat has little to no effect on low quality evidence, if I remember correctly. So turning around and claiming, oh, this is going to do it. All we need to do is increase seed oils and we'll reduce heart disease by 30%. There's no evidence for that. There's just no evidence based on what you've presented.
Well, saying there's no evidence is false because I just showed evidence of that. So like that.
Meta-analysis. You can't prove it based on one study. We agree about that. That was your pyramid that you showed.
Sure. I agree.
Just quickly, guys.
And this was your opening. This was your opening paper.
Yeah,
guys. Let's just try and keep this respectful. But with regards as we move on from LA veteran study, I just want to clarify: is Tucker, what are the major problems that you see with that study in terms of the design or the intervention?
I mean, it's like it's not a terrible. Well, I mean. But there are some problems with it, but they don't seem to be super critical in the outcome of the paper. I mean, it did show a small benefit, right? Okay, small benefit. So is that consistent across all like studies? Not really. Another one showed no benefit. Another one showed a teeny benefit, right? So the problem I have is ignoring the evidence that contradicts the case.
Oh, well, no, I don't want to ignore. I definitely want to chat about all the other evidence, especially like the ones that you mentioned. At Minnesota, again, like I said, I think we both made our case, but happy to talk about some of the others, like the Sydney Diet Heart and Rose, if you wanted to as well.
Well, let's go to Hooper 2020. What's their top line summary?
Yeah. So so they mentioned for CVD mortality ACM. Was that where they said little to no benefit?
Their top line intake, all-cause mortality. Critical comments, critical importance. Reducing saturated fat intake probably makes little or no difference to all-cause mortality. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So reducing saturated fat intake probably makes little or no difference to cardiovascular mortality. Mm-hmm. Right? Finally, we get down on the third line. Reducing saturated fat intake probably reduces cardiovascular events. Mm-hmm. And then the effect of reducing saturated fat intake on risk of myocardial infarction is unclear as the evidence is of very low quality. Mm-hmm. Okay. Right? So when we take your meta-analysis that you opened up your argument with, where's the evidence? Yeah. So how far down in this paper that's 290 pages, do we have to go before we find some evidence?
Yeah. So and just to interject here, Matt, when you reply, I think it's important. Let's just try and stay in line with the debate, which is about coronary heart disease, where we can. Yeah. That should be the focus.
I agree. Yeah, I was just going to mention that, all-cause mortality. I know I mentioned for LA veterans too. I mean, that is a separate outcome, but as Tucker said, we didn't see a benefit there overall. Now, for CVD mortality, the issue is power. Very few trials are actually powered to detect a difference in risk there. Now, if the reduction in risk is not statistically significant, they're going to say, probably no benefit.
Which study are we talking about here?
For Hooper, right? As you just read, they said little to no benefit for CVD mortality, I believe. Correct? You just read that?
Right.
Yeah. And so, when it comes to mortality, I don't think these trials are really adequately powered to even determine that. I think events is a far more sensitive endpoint to look at. And, for that case, we do see a benefit. And sure, it is smaller than the benefit we see in Lyon Diet Heart.
But power is a statistical game, right?
Well,
look, okay, here's what power means. Power means your effect is so small that you need a huge population to detect it and get your p-value up above 0.05, right? So if you're telling me about oh, it's not powered to detect something. What you're saying in English is this effect is so tiny that we're only going to see this tiny little effect when we look at a massive population. So you're conceding the point. You're conceding the fact that they have little to no effect.
No,
because
I'm not
that's what
saying that.
Power means statistically.
Well, no, because when you look at specifically mortality, now cardiovascular mortality is going to happen less than cardiovascular events. I think we can agree on that, right? Not everybody who has an event is going to die from it, right?
Right.
Do we agree on that? Yeah. So not everybody who has a cardiovascular event is going to die because of that event. Now, would you hold the position that reducing overall number of events is beneficial?
It really depends what the trade-off is. I mean, I don't know if,
all else held equal. Let's say all else held equal.
All else is never held equal in biology.
Just hypothetical.
Right? Would I want to do given the totality of the evidence on seed oils, if I thought I was still going to die on the same day? No, I don't think that's useful.
Okay, but just
right. So I have one heart attack that kills me instead of two small heart attacks. That's what you're saying, basically.
No, I'm not, because.
But that's exactly it, right? You're
Matt,
saying.
Can you rephrase your question, Matt? I think it's a fair one to get a straight answer on.
Yeah. So my question is basically that. I mean, well, before I ask the question, we both agree that cardiovascular mortality is going to happen less often than events, right? Not everybody who has a heart attack will die. That much I think Tucker and I already agreed upon, correct? Just to ensure?
Pretty much indisputable, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I just want to make sure so it's absolutely clear for people listening. So then my question would be, provided all else is held equal, let's just give that hypothetical for a second here. Provided all else held equal, is reducing the number of cardiovascular events a good thing? Not
necessarily, Matt.
All else, so there's no other factor
not at play? Look, if I'm going to have 2 heart attacks, right? Let's say we're talking about 3 heart attacks here, right? One is going to be a little one that I may not even notice, right? The autopsy data makes it clear that lots of people have heart attacks and don't even know about them. And then there are 2 other ones, which is going to kill me. Do I care? No.
So you would take the position that a reduction in events is not necessarily anything to really care about.
I mean, there's only one reason why we care about heart attacks or atherosclerosis, and that's because it kills you. Right?
No, that is absolutely false. I would 100% disagree. I have family members who survived heart attacks. It is not fun. It is not a good thing.
No, it's not.
It can cripple you.
I got to watch my dad go through it. Yeah. No, it's not fun.
Yeah, so I think saying that the reason we care about heart attacks is just because of death is not, it doesn't follow there. I mean, I certainly care about family members or myself having a heart attack. It's clearly important.
Right, and if they have a heart attack that they don't notice, how much do you care about that?
Sure, but are you saying that when we look at these reduction in events, that it's silent MI?
We're going off down on another tangent here. Let's get back to Hooper.
So.
Right? Yeah, little or no effect.
That's not. But when we look at events, there was a reduction. And are you suggesting that the reduction in events was specific to silent MI?
Actually, specifically what they said. Let me go back here because I was trying to look for something else.
How are you guys going for time, by the way?
I'm okay for a bit. I mean, yeah, I'm fine for a little bit.
So what do they say for your paper, Hooper 2020, myocardial infarctions specifically? The effect of reducing saturated fat intake on risk of myocardial infarction is unclear as the evidence is of very low quality.
Yeah.
Okay, let's put that aside now, right? You're making an argument that is not supported by your reference.
Well, no, cardiovascular events, I have it on the screen right here. Total cardiovascular events.
I'm looking at the summary of the paper, myocardial, page 3.
Yeah, can you go to CVD events? Sorry, I'm talking about CVD events, total CVD events, not MI here. We can talk about that.
Combined cardiovascular events. It's the next line up. Reducing saturated fat intake probably reduces cardiovascular events.
Yeah, and they found a 22% reduction.
Moderate evidence.
Yeah, sure. That I don't
Does
dispute
the
that. That's
paper
fine.
define what a cardiovascular event
Yeah,
is? Then?
so it's like MI. It includes angina, I believe. I believe it includes cerebral infarction as well. It's a combined endpoint. But like, so again, my question, or I mean, it sounds like you.
Right. So we're looking at small RRs here, 0.96, 0.94, 0.83, 0.90. Right.
For which table? I have it on the screen.
Page 3. It's right at the top.
Oh no, but I'm looking at cardiovascular events. I'm still talking about that specific outcome.
Well, here, then let me show the screen. Page 3 from Hooper, this top line summary of this paper. Right?
Mm-hmm.
All of these items are critical.
Oh, I know why we were having why we were crossing why we weren't seeing the same thing. You're looking at reduction of saturated fat. I was looking specifically at replacing saturated fat with PUFA. I'm
looking at your paper. This is what you opened with.
And in that, and what I showed was specifically the results for replacing saturated fat with PUFA, right? This isn't a debate about saturated fat, it's about vegetable oil. Which is
still little or no effect.
I mean, but again, we can talk about whether or not that the reduction in events is important.
Right. So to put this back in the big picture, here we are looking at a population that has cardiovascular disease as the number one cause of death. And the biggest change in this population over the last 100 years has been a massive increase in the consumption of omega-6 polyunsaturated fats.
Mm-hmm.
And my question to you is, given that we've already done the intervention that you're recommending and observing that there are some huge confounders like smoking in there, at what point of increased...
smoking in which? Smoking in which?
Smoking's a big confounder for cardiovascular disease over the last
in which specific study?
We both agree on that.
Yeah, but which specific paper you said that I cited?
I'm talking general here, big picture.
Okay, sorry. I thought you were referring to something.
Big picture.
Yeah, that's my mistake.
So you're recommending an intervention to lower cardiovascular disease risk. I would like to get it back to where it is in the Tsimene, where it's undetectable, or in the Maasai, or in even I'll take the Navajo Indians from the paper you sent over, where they have a fraction of the risk of the Framingham cohort, right? At what point does this massive increase in vegetable oil consumption in the United States start to work? We've done the intervention.
No, so we have to look at how it's consumed, though. I don't believe in consuming vegetable oils in the form of ultra-processed foods that are hyper-palatable is the same as consuming it in a veggie stir-fry or something. I mean, there are huge differences there. I don't think that it's an apples-to-apples comparison. I agree with that.
The most dangerous form of... I actually just... I didn't provide you with this reference because we're going off topic here. Martin Grootveld, I think his name is. He is the world expert on how to damage an omega-6 fat. And you know what the worst thing to do to it is? You know what makes it the most toxic? Stir fry. Worse than deep frying.
I mean, I haven't seen the study, so I can't really comment on it one way or the other. But happy to.
Okay, so it sounds like though we're making progress here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it almost sounds like you're conceding that they're harmful, and that how we take them, that they're harmful in the context of a highly processed food. You just said
no, that
and they're not harmful in the context of a vegetable stir fry.
That's absolutely progress. Not. I want to be very clear. That's not what I'm saying.
Okay, so what are you saying?
I'm saying that in the package that is in, say, typically ultra-processed foods, for the most part, you have so much going on. You have a lot of fat content in the form of oftentimes vegetable oils. You have a lot of refined carbohydrates, added sugars, salts. You have all sorts of things going on that make it hyper-palatable and easy to overeat. That in and of itself can lead to an increased risk of disease. I am not saying that the vegetable oils themselves are the culprit there. Not at all.
Okay, fine. But let's go back to looking at what's happened to the American diet over the last 100 odd years, the single biggest change has been the increase in vegetable oil.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I mean,
so at what point do we start to see these benefits?
Well, look, I mean, if you want to look at ecological associations, can I share my screen for a sec?
Sure. Can I just clarify, Matt, because I think Tucker's making an interesting point.
Okay, yeah.
Tucker's saying that there has been a significant increase in linoleic acid consumption, but we haven't seen the incidence of cardiovascular disease drop as you may otherwise suspect. Yeah. You're saying, well, that's because a lot of that linoleic acid is in the form of ultra-processed food.
Yes, I'm saying that it is not the linoleic acid or vegetable oils specifically causing that problem. They could very well be an innocent bystander there. For all we know, it could be even worse if they were throwing, say, butter in there or something. We can't, based on these ecological associations of seeing a trend in one way correlating with another trend with zero adjustment for confounders or even consideration for confounders. I don't think you can draw any sort of conclusion from that.
Well, I started off by saying that there's a huge confounder in there, right? Smoking is a huge confounder.
Yeah, but
so I'll concede that a big part of the bump in cardiovascular disease in the middle of the last century was probably due to smoking, and that the decline was probably due to the decline in smoking. I mean, that's what Mazafarian's research for the American Heart Association, another paper I already didn't include here, indicates, right? I mean, nobody's taking the other side that smoking's really bad for cardiovascular disease risk, I presume.
But I want to pose a question to both of you here, because I think we're getting to a bit more of an instructive point of this conversation. How do you disentangle the influence of an increase in the omega-6 linoleic acid and the fact that, say, 60% of the US calories come from ultra-processed foods? How do you go about disentangling that to identify if the omega-6s are inherently harmful?
Yeah, so I mean, on my end, I would look to trials that aim to keep the rest of the diet very similar and look at specifically what happens with vegetable oil consumption in place of, obviously it has to be in place of something, ideally in place of saturated fat, given that that's kind of what most people would be replacing anyway. That's where I like the LA Veterans trial, as I mentioned. Similarly, if you were to look at prospective cohorts, then you're considering, okay, what are dietary confounders? Can we adjust for overall diet quality? Can we adjust for smoking status, physical activity, and so on? It's not perfect, but do your best to isolate that as the sole variable. That would be my approach.
Which relies on the epidemiological data that we've already discussed the problems with.
Which is
I mean, there are Simon, to answer your question, not looking specifically at cardiovascular disease, but I mean, obesity is very closely related to it, right? We agree that it's predisposing, I think we can say. And, there are animal models where they've varied the macronutrients, carbohydrates, fat, and protein to try and disentangle which experimentally what's driving obesity. And in that case, it's clearly the fat, but they used the same kind of fat all the way through the diet. So they didn't try and disentangle the different fats. So the short answer to your very astute question is the research hasn't been done there. And as I said, I'm not a fan of the epidemiology. I mean, Johnny Anitas, the famed epidemiologist, wrote a great paper where he said every food causes cancer, and he went through and looked at the epidemiological research showing that, like, you can pick anything, and there's a paper out there showing that it causes cancer, just to throw out a disease. So it's impossible to disentangle that using epidemiological evidence because the data errors are so huge on the inside, right? Maybe you can find a difference between something like a macronutrient where it's a huge percentage and your error in measurement isn't going to be that important. But if we're talking about a food that's a small, or ought to be evolutionarily, a small percentage of the diet, and you have these massive measurement errors, I mean, the papers that Matt sent over to support his argument, which he hasn't brought up yet, but I will, looking at the correlation between FFQ data and linoleic acid, it's a weak correlation at best in those epidemiological studies. I mean, that's one of the worst data points that they have just because.
Oh, that's not true.
It's absolutely true. That's what your papers say, right? And then we can get into issues like, NHANES, 80% of the data, 50 to 80% of the data they collect is physiologically implausible because a human can't survive on that intake that they get from the FFQ. And then we look at things like, where do people get a lot of their seed oils? It's from eating out. Does the Nurses' Health Study include that data? No. They look at, you ate salad dressing, right? Go look at the back of a bottle of salad dressing. It may say vegetable oil includes corn oil or canola oil or soybean oil, and they're throwing whichever oil they have that's cheapest on the market in there, which is fine for them, but terrible if you're an epidemiologist trying to figure out, if you're at 3% of the diet or 5% of the diet, because you have no idea what's coming in the front end. And then to turn around and take those small little, those massive measurement errors, trying to figure out these small little percentages of diet and then extrapolate that through to disease outcomes, grossly it's possible. But if you're looking at minute stuff, we won't even get into the fact that the adjustments are all baloney. I mean, Okay, so one of the papers Matt sent over, this was a beaut. It was Harvard School of Public Health. I think it was Wang 2016, maybe.
Yeah,
anyway, I was looking at.
I'm aware. Yeah, no, I know which one you're talking about. They're just letting me know.
Okay, well, just for the benefit of the audience, so they're looking at oxidized LDL and disease risk and cardiovascular risk, right? And they're saying this was a beaut. Harvard School of Public Health. So first pass, they find that oxidative stress is associated with cardiovascular disease. And then they adjust it by LDL and they say, look, it's not related to cardiovascular disease. The problem is, a month after that paper came out, another paper came out showing that the test they were using can't distinguish between oxidized LDL and LDL. And in fact, in one study I saw, the correlation of that test for ox-LDL and LDL was 0.999. So Harvard adjusted ox-LDL by itself and then published a paper that they'd never corrected saying, oh, look, it doesn't have any risk. Well, that's completely bogus. Completely bogus. They literally were doing statistical tricks based on a test that, granted, that they just flat didn't understand, and they didn't understand wasn't doing the thing that they were doing it for. And that is something that you see all the time in epidemiological research. They may be really good at building FFQs. They may be really good at doing the process of producing an epidemiological paper. Walter Willett, he's the guy in epidemiological nutritional. I'm getting to a point here,
okay,
right? So he came out with some antioxidant papers showing, we think these papers are going to show benefit. Turn around, when you do the actual study, they show harm. We have lots of papers looking at, for instance, vitamin E intake. Vitamin E intake, it's an antioxidant. We're talking about an oxidative process here. Should show benefit. Well, it turns out it doesn't. It shows harm. Why does it show harm? Because when you look at the mechanisms, vitamin E actually accelerates lipid peroxidation. Oops. Right? It's frustrating because there's this huge body of research, much of which is totally misleading. And when you rely on that, you're just looking at, it's Wall Street, garbage in, garbage out. I mean, if I get a data set and it failed a simple realities check, if I got like a trade file from a counterparty and I started figuring out that it was just bogus, I don't go through and adjust it. I throw it out. I get a good file.
I think you've said quite a bit here, so I just want to be conscious of giving Matt some time.
Yeah.
Let's give Matt a chance to reply.
There's a lot there. I think the ox-LDL stuff we've largely covered. I mean, we could get into that, but I'll leave that to the side for a second here. Regarding the ecological associations, essentially that you're pointing out, and for those listening, those are kind of the correlations between intake and seed oils over time, and maybe cardiovascular risk.
Can I interject? The worst sort of observational evidence, by the way.
But that's what you've been citing, right? That's what you've been citing.
Because it's a critical point. That's what we live in.
What? So it's the worst type of observational research, but it's critical to this argument?
Yes, because every one of us goes out every day into the real world and eats the food environment that is around us. We live in the ecology. We don't live in a mathematical model in an epidemiological paper.
So then, if we look at association, or if we look at cigarette consumption and life expectancy across populations, we see a correlation, a pretty consistent correlation between higher cigarette consumption and higher life expectancy. Should we consider that critical data here?
Well, fine. Sort of makes my point.
Well, no, it doesn't. This is the ecological data. Now, if we perform epidemiology, which is how we know cigarettes cause cancer, by the way, we isolate the effects of the cigarettes as best we can, and we see very consistent findings there across various populations, across levels of exposure, and so on. So this is the type of data that you're suggesting is important simply because it's referring to population level intake, but we're making inferences based on individual level intake, right? I want to know if I eat vegetable oils, or if my family eats vegetable oils, or friends, or whoever, will they be increasing the risk of disease? I don't want to know if on a population basis, if they're consuming vegetable oils in whatever possible combinations and forms that they can possibly do, does that correlate at a population level with higher rates of disease? It's not really useful to the individual level of does it actually affect your risk? And if it was, then here you go. Cigarettes increase lifespan, apparently. And we know that that's not the case based on largely epidemiology. Now, I've gone over the concordance again between epidemiology and RCTs. We see a 69% concordance based on the Schwing-Shackle paper. And you were mentioning the trials with vitamin E and all that. Was that referring to the Young and Carr analysis that you cited? Because I know they looked at some trials.
There's a whole body of evidence looking at vitamin E as an intervention to try and prevent ox-LDL oxidation or LDL oxidation, and it doesn't work. Yeah. And in fact, it's been found to be worse.
Okay.
The epidemic. I don't remember the paper right off the top of my head. I don't think it's one of the ones that I included.
Okay. I don't have many qualms with that. I just wanted to understand specifically where it was coming from, if it was that paper or something else. Other than that, I can't actually. There was a bit of a lot of info that came out there. I'm not sure exactly if there's anything else that I didn't address, but I think I've made my main kind of point there. So I think as far as trials that we didn't talk about, the one that I definitely wanted to talk about a lot was LA Veterans. We got to that. We talked about Minnesota. Maybe, I don't know if you want to talk about Sydney and Rose as the two other ones that you suggest were specific to linoleic acid. Is that?
Well, yeah, they both show harm. Rose shows a lot of harm, right? And yes, they're small studies, and I know all the issues with it, but
Yeah. So
again, you can't keep. This is one of the big problems that I have with folks like Mozaffarian or even Hooper, for that matter, is that they are very good at tossing studies for, in some cases, invalid reasons, right?
Okay. So yeah, with Sydney, I think it is valid simply because, it's clear that they use the Miracle brand margarine in their intervention group. And we see here that the deputy chairman
the composition of which we have no idea.
The person who worked for Unilever, who was the company that produced the margarine, says that it had about 15% trans fats.
How does he know that? When were they measuring it? They surely weren't measuring it then.
Well, I have no idea, honestly, how they know that one way or another. But I'm sure that if anybody were to know, it would be him. Based on the fact that he,
honestly,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's just not compelling. And at any rate, we're back to the same issue we had with MCE, and at some level, trans fats cause and I think they even knew it, right? So they specifically designed the intervention because they wanted to lower, their whole point of their intervention was to lower cholesterol. And they were aware that trans fats wouldn't have that effect. And they did lower cholesterol.
Yeah, again.
So they can't have had, we get back to the same argument we had about MCE. And at any rate, we're always going to look at these studies being confounded by trans fats.
Well, no,
right? Because the process of cooking seed oils produces trans fats.
Not the same amounts. Let's say for a second it's 15% trans fat in there, you're not producing that by cooking an unhydrogenated oil.
Show me the number. What's the percentage of trans fats from a reliable source in that paper?
In that paper, again, we don't know. We know the brand, we know the time, we know the.
We don't know. I agree.
So it is possible. We can at the very least say it is absolutely possible.
Or we can say it's absolutely not possible.
Yeah. Okay. So
we can say that the biomarker that we're tracking, the whole point of the intervention, shows that the effect we were having, the effect that we wanted to have, which was lowering cholesterol, and that nevertheless more of them died.
Yeah, but I mean, you could lower cholesterol and continue smoking, or they could have adopted a smoking habit and lowered their cholesterol through dietary means, and we wouldn't say that they benefited. There could be other mechanisms at play. I'm not married to the idea that trans fats simply increase. One other point, back to the MCE data, one of the things that Ramsden points out is that the greater the cholesterol lowering, the worse the mortality. Right? Okay.
Which would suggest that the people with the least trans fats, evidenced by their lower cholesterol, are having worse effects.
Or they were having more of the margarine that also was high in PUFAs that lower. But I'm not sure
they had the lowest cholesterol. So cholesterol level is a marker of trans fat intake.
No, well, it's a marker of various fats. I'm sure. Do you agree that there are
it goes up on certain types of saturated fats? It goes up on trans fats. It goes down on linoleic acid. That's why linoleic acid is being prescribed in all of these trials because it has the effect of lowering cholesterol.
Yeah, and so which
is supposed to reduce heart disease rates, except when you do it on a strict linoleic acid intervention, it doesn't.
Well, so if we look at it is absolutely possible that linoleic acid intake in a trial that also included trans fats leads to a net reduction in LDL. Absolutely possible. Or serum, they measured, typically total serum cholesterol in these studies based on the time or at that time. But we know that if you have a high linoleic acid margarine that is also, relative to typical trans fat content, high in trans fats, although much lower than the overall linoleic acid or PUFA content, you can still see a net reduction in cholesterol, but still have net harm. I am not at all married to the idea that trans fats increase risk solely based on LDL raising. There could absolutely be other things at play there.
All right. Well, they have negative effects on mitochondria, and so does linoleic acid. That's well demonstrated.
The fact that they lowered cholesterol does not negate the possibility that the trans fats were able to produce harm.
Okay, so let's take a look at if I can find this. So this I thought was a fascinating little paper, because they're showing olive oil is beneficial. They're claiming it's because of the oxidative effect. Oddly, and here's what they say: we estimate that substituting 10 grams a day of other fats, including margarine, butter, mayonnaise, and dairy fat with olive oil, was associated with reductions in the risk of total and cause-specific mortality. Well, I'll observe that 2 of those, margarine and mayonnaise, are seed oil foods. Right? So this paper seems to be saying that certain seed oil foods, which are not cooked, mayonnaise generally is not cooked, are harmful. Right? Now, this paper has so many problems with it, not least of all is that they seem to have adjusted their data set to eliminate polyunsaturated fats, which I find, and I've looked and looked and looked to try and figure out what exactly they're doing and why they're doing it.
Sorry, can you explain that? What do you mean by they're adjusting for polyunsaturated fats?
Yeah, I know. Third, the models were adjusted for modified. Are we looking at this now? Can you guys see my screen?
I can see
I
it.
can see it. I can see it.
The models were adjusted for modified AHEI, which is their healthy eating index, their adjusted healthy eating index, without polyunsaturated fatty acids and alcohol components. Why on earth would they be doing that? And they've adjusted these models several times in the past to try and come up with something that was actually healthy, because the first couple versions didn't work. So we're looking at a study where they're claiming that replacing olive oil of certain seed oil fats with olive oil is a benefit to mortality. And we'll note that this is all a model. It's not actually intervention, right? It's the sort of thing that we were discussing before, right? But they're showing that lowering the seed oil consumption for certain elements lowers mortality. And they're claiming this is the benefit of olive oil, which, by the way, I completely agree with them on. But it's a bit of a mystery, just as kind of, this was one of the charts that I led with up here. Less susceptible to oxidation. Why is olive oil less susceptible to oxidation? Because it has less omega-6 fats, right? Those are the fats that are oxidized. And what does that lead to? Anti-inflammatory and anti-atherogenic. And they list, this is a classic case of a paper that's got something for everybody. Matt can be happy that they show butter is bad, and I'm happy that they show mayo and margarine is bad. This is 2022 paper, right? So even this seems to show that there are cases where seed oil consumption is harmful, although observing this paper, the fact that they remove polyunsaturated fatty acids, I don't even know what to make of this paper. How are they including mayo if they've removed polyunsaturated fatty acids?
So, I think that's explainable. So for starters, the alcohol, how they left that out? That's because it was already adjusted previously. So it was adjusted in a previous model.
Right.
So,
yes.
So
that I found.
Yeah. Okay. Just making sure that's clear. Now, for polyunsaturated fat, it wouldn't make sense to adjust for PUFA when a part of what you're comparing is includes PUFA, right? You don't want to adjust by itself. It doesn't make sense. So
they're saying without the components. They're taking these components out.
Yeah, so they're adjusting for the alternate healthy eating index, but not including PUFA in that score because you want to look at the effect of PUFA given that the oils that they're substituting, right? You don't want to adjust by the intervention. That would be an over-adjustment. Or not the intervention, you know what I mean, the exposure that we're looking at. It would be an over-adjustment to adjust for PUFA, right? Imagine
no, but they're not adjusting it, they're removing it.
Yeah, exactly, that's my point. They're removing it from the model.
Yeah.
You don't
they're removing something that they have to have in here to show an effect of olive oil.
No. They're
right.
not. They're
and they're obviously Matt, they're obviously not removing it because they're including margarine and mayonnaise. Right.
In the model?
Well,
no. So they're.
We estimated that substituting 10 grams a day of other fats, including margarine, PUFA, butter, not PUFA, mayonnaise, PUFA, and dairy fat, not PUFA, with olive oil was associated with reductions in the risk of total and cause-specific mortality.
Yeah.
Matt, can I offer a suggestion here? Because it seems like you're both looking at this from different angles. Can you provide an example of why you're saying that would be over-adjustment using some other example, perhaps?
Yeah, so what would be a good example? I think we disagree on this anyway, but LDL is the typical one. So let me just use like saturated fat, for example. And just bear with me, Tucker. I know we disagree on the topic anyway, but it's just easy for me to use this as an example. So if you want to look at the association between, say, saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease, right? And if you suspect that saturated fat increased risk of cardiovascular disease by raising your LDL cholesterol levels, you don't want to adjust for LDL levels because you would be removing kind of the factor that is responsible for the outcome, or at least one of the main factors that is responsible for the outcome, right? If A leads to B and B leads to C, but you remove B, you're not going to see an association between A and C.
But that's not exactly what they're doing, though.
I know it's not. I just wanted to explain over adjustment for a second, and I'll bring it back to this here. So in this study, when they're looking at replacing substituting fatty acid sources, and when some of those fatty acid sources are rich in polyunsaturated fats, and all of them to a degree obviously contain some polyunsaturated fats, you don't want to adjust by polyunsaturated fat intake, because if you're feeding something like vegetable oils that are high in polyunsaturated fats, but you make sure you're only comparing that amongst people who are eating similar amounts of polyunsaturated fats, well, then that's useless information. And so they removed it from the model so that they don't over-adjust in that sense.
Yeah, that sort of sounds like they're trying to show that saturated fat causes cardiovascular disease, and they're removing dairy from it.
Sorry? Did they do that here with the dairy? I don't see that.
No, they didn't do it with dairy.
Okay.
They did it with polyunsaturated fatty acids, right? Which are the components that lead to oxidation in this model. We're definitely going...
No, I think there's a huge misunderstanding here. So it's not the same, right? The way them removing that from the model or from the healthy eating index score allows us to see the effect of changes in polyunsaturated fat intake. It doesn't remove that effect. If they were including it in the model and adjusting for that variable, only comparing people consuming similar amounts of polyunsaturated fats, then you would be removing the impact of vegetable oils. So the way that they did it is actually appropriate for determining the effect that vegetable oils may have. And funny enough, in this in the plot, when you replace olive oil with vegetable oils, if anything, there was a trend towards benefit for cardiovascular mortality. Compared to
which one would expect to see. At any rate, sorry, this is a bit of a tangent here.
Sure.
Although, again, if we're going back to the mechanisms of how these things are causing harm, what this is suggesting is that reducing polyunsaturated fats here, I mean, they kind of back end it where they say that olive oil also exerts anti-inflammatory and anti-atherogenic effects. Yes, it does, because it's low in omega-6 fats. And it may help reduce oxidative stress. Again, the definition of oxidative stress as used in the literature is the presence of oxidized omega-6 fats, right?
Okay, but according to their results, if anything, vegetable oils may have even been beneficial over olive oil for cardiovascular.
Unless they're in mayonnaise or margarine, in which case they're harmful.
In which case, I believe this, if you scroll up to the, if you care to, the timeline here, this is going back to, I believe, the 80s. And again, trans fats may have been confounding the margarine there. And mayonnaise is not just vegetable oil. It's also filled with eggs, egg yolks, and that as well. So, it's not...
I know.
Again, our debate is centered on seed oils. That was the debate proposition. That was the topic at hand. It is not these other... foods that might contain vegetable oils one way or another.
Yeah, guys, let's come back to the actual debate at hand. What was it in this study here? What was found for vegetable oils, seed oils?
Yeah, so basically they did a substitute. I mean, this study was centered on olive oil, let's be clear, but they did a substitution analysis.
Which is a low linoleic acid. That's not a seed oil.
High monounsaturated,
Right.
And they found that when you replace olive oil, this was per 100 grams per day based on their model. If you replace olive oil with margarine, butter, or mayonnaise, you have higher risk of cardiovascular mortality. Same with if you replace with dairy fat. But if you replace olive oil with vegetable oils, there weren't any statistically significant differences. And if anything, it kind of leaned towards there being benefit with the vegetable oils over the olive oil. For, again, the cardiovascular outcome, which is what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's an odd study.
But do you have any criticisms for that? Otherwise, as far as the findings?
Yeah, I have a criticism. I mean, I went through this with another study from this group where they hid data that I gather, didn't like by grouping odd things together, right? Like grouping margarine, butter, mayonnaise, and dairy fat. Now, there are lots of studies on dairy fat and mortality showing that it has a benefit. So it's a little odd here that they are grouping it together with margarine and mayonnaise, given their composition with then butter and dairy fat. Even in studies that show dairy fat has a benefit, butter specifically seems to show a bit of harm, and that's another long topic.
Well,
but
yeah, and
what they did
what
they did in another study, back to the correlation between obesity and heart disease, is they showed that potatoes fried in seed oils were far and away the most obesogenic food that they looked at, and then potatoes not fried in seed oils, boiled or with butter, had minimal obesogenic impact. And so they grouped them in such a way to minimize the effect, to make it less obvious that what they were seeing was an effect of seed oils, not an effect of carbohydrates, as they claimed. Because obviously, when you compare a boiled potato to a French fried potato, the thing that doesn't increase is carbohydrates. So they seem to be.
Yeah, I was just going to say that just like this all seems a little bit tangential to the point, right? Like the question was specifically about the olive oil for vegetable oil replacement, not the issues that you might have with the dairy fat replacement or the other outcomes. We're looking specifically at vegetable oils, right, being the topic of debate here. So, do you have an issue with
why did you include this paper then?
Didn't you? I'm pretty sure you included this one. I mean, we both did. We both did, actually. Yeah, I included it simply to show that, I think both olive oil and vegetable oils are healthy. I think both are great, and this shows that both, overall for total mortality, very similar. For cardiovascular mortality, which is the topic of debate, possibly even beneficial for vegetable oils. So I included it really for that reason, because I figured you do, as far as I'm aware anyway, believe olive oil is a pretty healthy oil. So I'm just wondering, do you have any qualms with that finding specifically? Not necessarily, I understand there's different types of dairy fat, different sources have different effects. I agree with all of that, but specific to the olive oil for vegetable oil replacement.
I think that the claim mechanism here supports my argument that, if they're trying.
Why isn't it borne out in the outcomes?
Well, potential mechanisms for olive oil intake and mortality, less susceptible to oxidation, right?
Sure.
Well,
and
there's only one thing that's getting oxidized in any of these fats.
I think, guys, I think the contention here is around why there was not a significant difference between olive oil and vegetable oils in terms of risk. That's where it seems like you guys are disagreeing here.
I want to agree. That is what I'm trying to hammer home here.
Right. And yeah, I'm just making the point that if you're, as with all of these studies that I have referenced previously, if you want to reduce oxidative stress, you do it by reducing omega-6 fats in the diet, practically speaking. They're saying here that has a benefit.
Sure, and I can grant that. All fine, that's fine. But why do we not see that?
Well, then the flip side of that argument is, fats that are more susceptible to oxidation would have pro-inflammatory and pro-atherogenic properties.
But if you scroll up to that list of all the mechanisms, there are a whole bunch of things at play. It is totally possible that one of them could be slightly worse in the case of PUFA and all the other ones improve.
Where are the mechanisms? Right chart there. Central illustration?
Yeah, right. So let's just say, I'll grant that. Let's say that the vegetable oils increase oxidation, but they actually improve. Guess what? Lipid profile, they improve even more than olive oil. Although I don't know if there's really statistically significant differences. But anyways, generally trends that direction. For some of these other mechanisms, maybe mechanisms that aren't listed here, there could be further benefit to the vegetable oils over olive oil. And they balance out or potentially even end up being better for the vegetable oils. So my question would just come back to that. Why do we not see a difference? And if anything, why does it trend towards benefit for vegetable oils if it is the case that vegetable oils are wreaking havoc in these ways that you presume?
I think that's a fair question. I feel like that's kind of where we need to get to in terms of resolving this paper.
I don't know that this paper gives an answer to that question. At least it doesn't to me. We go back to the question that if you want to resolve that, if you want to figure that out, you have to do an RCT in people.
Okay.
So it's been done.
So
this is just a model.
So, but for this specific study, then you don't actually have a specific issue with that finding. Just to be clear, other than the fact that you think there might be better data, that's fine. But for that finding, you don't actually have an issue.
No, I'm pointing it out that there, if you think that omega-6 fats are beneficial, then you wouldn't be saying that olive oil is better because it doesn't have the qualities that are uniquely associated with omega-6 fats in the diet.
I didn't say olive oil is better.
Well, no, you didn't. This paper does.
Where does it say olive oil is better than vegetable oils?
Better in general, right? I mean, if you're
looking, does it say that?
It says it right in that paper that we were looking at, right?
Where?
Potential mechanisms for olive oil intakes and mortality, less susceptible to oxidation.
There's nowhere there that it says. There's nowhere in this paper where they say that olive oil would be better than vegetable oils.
No,
they cardiovascular disease risk.
They did. You're right. They don't say it. You have to be familiar with the mechanisms behind the terms that they use, right?
Sure. And again,
so when they say oxidative stress, the markers that are used for oxidative stress are oxidized omega-6 fats, right? I've already cited a whole bunch of papers showing that what is oxidized in LDL is the omega-6 fats, and that if you replace them, like they would suggest you do, with MUFAs, like oleic acid in olive oil, that you make them less susceptible to oxidation. So no, they don't explicitly say it. You have to understand the mechanisms behind what they're saying. You have to you have to understand the terms that they're using and the implications of those terms.
I mean, I think a good point here, or it'd be a good point, if you don't mind, for me just to talk a little bit about why I don't place as much stock in these mechanisms. So if you don't mind, if you're okay with that,
go ahead.
Share my screen and you just have to unshare. Okay. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I talked about the concordance between nutritional epidemiology and randomized controlled trials, human outcomes. Here, I want to just review some of the research on mechanisms and how they translate to outcomes. So for starters, especially given that animal models are typically used, if we look at the translation of cardiovascular animal models to human randomized controlled trials...
Whoa, wait a minute. Simon, my main argument has been using human data, not animal model translation.
Yeah.
This is a huge tangent.
No, it's not, because I'm going to get to in vitro as well. It's just I have a few slides in a row. If you just indulge for like a second here, I'm not going to...
Matt, you can go through it, but just be careful not to misrepresent Tucker's position.
Yeah, and so, just we can even skip over the animal part. That's fine. But if we look at, for example, highly promising cancer biology discoveries, so mechanisms, or this could be in vitro research, it could be animal research too, sure. Stuff that is thought to be groundbreaking. These are mechanisms that are thought to really change the game. Over the course of 15 years, we see a translation rate of about 19%.
Yeah, that's okay, Matt, again, you are talking about something that is totally outside the scope of our discussion here. We started off pretty much talking about human data, and I've tried to stick with the human data, not to get off on tangents on animal models.
So wait, no, this isn't necessary. This is
Matt. How does this relate? How does this specifically relate to any data that Tugger has presented?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the mechanisms at play, like oxidation and stuff, like these are oftentimes done by, if you're testing, say, lag timed oxidation, these aren't done in the plasma. These are done in like petri dishes, essentially, exposure to copper sulfate.
And the model I cite, this paper I studied, Reven 1993, was looking at humans, not...
Okay. And that, but were they oxidizing? Sorry, which paper in particular?
Reven 1993, where they were feeding olive oil or some seed oil, I can't remember which one, and then looking at the effect that had on the oxidizability of LDL.
Okay. Yeah, and so...
And that is a case, by the way, where there are animal models, and the human data is been shown to be consistent with the animal models of the oxidizability of LDL. That was done back in the 1980s.
In describing the mechanisms. Now, this is important here, what I'm showing, because this is translating the mechanisms to effective treatment, to actual outcomes. And this can include human trials looking at mechanisms. This can include animal trials looking at mechanisms. This can also include in vitro trials. It's not split up. But what I'm pointing out is that there are mechanisms that could be at play that don't bear out when we look at the outcome data. Similarly, if we look at clinical trial success rates from phase 1, which are human studies, by the way, phase 1 human trials through phase 3 and through approval, we see a 6.9% clinical success rate or success rate in translation. That is abysmal, especially compared. You shift a decimal point on that.
Matt, this is totally a tangent.
How? This is comparing human data in phase 1 trials. This is
because we've already been discussing human endpoint RCTs.
I understand, but what you were just referring to were a bunch of mechanisms as reason to believe something is the case
that have already been demonstrated in human RCTs. Yes,
but you're suggesting but there's contradictory information amongst the RCTs, and we've discussed some specifics of individual ones. Sure, we disagree.
Yes, there's take statins. There are contradictory results in those RCTs too. That doesn't mean that we don't prescribe them.
Matt, so just to clarify, you're saying because you were looking at the outcomes in randomized controlled trials and that you're agreeing to disagree at certain parts there, and there are some conflicts in the data, that you want to bring it back to why the mechanism may not be something to believe.
I want to basically highlight why suggesting that mechanisms are at play does not trump the outcome data. Now we can disagree on what the outcome data shows. That is fine. But I don't believe we can disagree about the outcome data based on mechanisms. That is the point that I'm trying to make. We have abysmal translation rates between mechanisms to outcomes, and we have far higher translation rates from nutritional epidemiology to outcomes in RCTs. So if one were to consider mechanisms as reason to claim that an outcome, whether it be in a randomized trial or otherwise, is not true or is somehow debunked by this mechanism, you'd have to accept that nutritional epidemiology is really solid because we have a much higher, according to this, 10 times higher translation rate. That is the point I'm trying to make.
I still don't see the relevance, but whatever. What I was trying to explain to you is the mechanisms in the paper that you shared not really supporting your argument. But
and I'm just saying that the outcomes do. Right, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying the outcomes do, regardless of what the
well, not even in that paper do they, because they say that replacing foods which are rich in seed oils benefits mortality. In your paper.
Well, I'm not talking about foods that contain vegetable oils. This debate is about vegetable
But you can't distinguish them. All foods.
Yeah,
look, nobody drinks soybean oil.
Yeah, sure.
Soybean oil is a component in food. You cannot separate seed oils from foods that contain them. That's an absurd claim to make.
Well, that's like saying you live in a house with smokers and you wouldn't be at higher risk because you don't smoke or something. Like you're being exposed to other factors.
Poor analogy.
Oh, sorry. It's
right, but you can't distinguish. You can't distinguish the effect of drinking soybean oil and the effect of consuming soybean oil and mayonnaise.
Can you bring the study back up, Matt?
Yeah. Which one in particular?
Well, it seems like you're still talking about that olive oil paper to me.
Yeah, I'll bring it up.
And just to know, we're nearly at 3.5 hours, so I think maybe we have.
Okay, I
think we have another. I think we have another 10 minutes of going back and forth, and then let's get into the closing statements.
Yeah,
if that's okay.
Okay, so this was it anyway, Simon. If you wanted if you wanted any specific clarification one way or the other.
And what's the point that you're trying to make here, Matt?
So basically, what I was saying was that. I clarified that the fact that they mention certain mechanisms here, which they don't actually use to say that that olive oil is superior to vegetable oils in any way. They just suggest that they are some of the benefits potentially to olive oil consumption.
That's not entirely. Yeah, they suggest that the benefits are due to those mechanisms.
Sure.
Right, and then in this chart, they show specifically that replacing olive oil for margarine and for mayonnaise shows a benefit, and then this is my big problem with this paper, and then they segregate out for other vegetable oils. So of the 3 categories of vegetable oils that they show in this paper, 2 of them have harm that is reduced by switching out to olive oil.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't take issue with that because those aren't looking specifically at vegetable oils. My point is that when you look specifically...
What's margarine made of?
It's made of vegetable oils and other compounds. I mean, it could be, especially given the time of the follow-up. I can't recall exactly when this trial started, but I believe it was around the 80s. And
margarine's been made with vegetable oils for at least the last 100 years. They stopped using beef tallow in the 1800s.
But I'm talking about trans fats. Now, I'm talking about trans fats, but the thing is, you don't think trans fats are necessarily a problem.
No, but I'll concede, but also they started reducing trans fats in foods quite a long time ago, and I do believe they addressed that in this paper. But again, trans fats are not going to be in mayonnaise, and eggs have been shown repeatedly not to be harmful. So
well, I mean, that's a separate topic. But I think that's a separate topic. Maybe another time. But I think we can agree at the very least that that margarine and mayonnaise are not isolated vegetable oils. Can we at least agree on that?
No, we can't agree with that because they are. Because they're
isolated vegetable
every food that nobody eats vegetable oils alone. You eat them in something else. You eat them in French fries or in salad dressing or whatever else. So you can't say that there's some distinction between mayonnaise and salad dressing, right? You're still consuming vegetable oils.
I agree that we're still consuming vegetable oils. My question is, do we agree that if we're just to take if I had just a bottle of canola oil sitting here on my desk, and would you say that isolated vegetable oil is exactly the same in its contents to a bottle of mayonnaise or a container of margarine?
Obviously not. Come on.
Yeah. So that's my point. They aren't the same. Now, margarine.
But they are the same at the end of the day when you eat them as part of your diet, right?
Not necessarily.
Guys, let me interject here because we are getting to the end, and I think you're kind of talking past each other a little bit. I think the interesting question here for you two to discuss is why there was not a significant difference between olive oil and vegetable oil when vegetable oils were isolated with regards to total mortality, CVD mortality, cancer mortality, etc. I think that's the interesting point that you guys are currently disputing.
Yeah, and that was my point. So we can talk about, is mayonnaise going to be beneficial versus this, that, or the other thing. But the question I'd like to ask is, if you have a salad that you normally put olive oil on and you swapped it out for canola oil, would you be at greater harm? Let's just start with that. Very simple. Would you be...
Fatty acid composition is almost the same, so no.
Okay, if you replaced it with soybean oil, we'll say, or safflower oil.
I would expect so, yes.
You would expect the results to be the same?
No, I would expect it to be worse.
Oh, to be worse. Okay, well, why isn't that borne out in the evidence here?
It's epidemiology, Matt.
So, but then again, we can't really rely on mechanisms if that's the case either, just based on the
well, you can rely, that's why RCTs trump epidemiology.
Yeah, and I think I've pointed out...
Yes, I do find it really interesting when even the Harvard School of Public Health shows a study that suggests that there is harm from vegetable oils like they do in this study. It's interesting because that's not their position. And when they're claiming the mechanisms are the same mechanisms that I'm claiming, I find that very interesting because those mechanisms are well demonstrated, and they're well demonstrated to be pertinent in humans, right, over the last 40 years of research. And, when your Boren 2020 study is citing the same line of evidence, starting with the same 1979 paper or the 1989 paper, there's a clear path here of harm from vegetable oils in the literature, including in the papers that you're citing. And when your opening paper, Hooper 2020, is showing no benefits, then, I think that's really interesting. And I don't know, maybe we should That's starting to sound like a summary, Simon. So maybe we should transition into that.
Yeah, I think we should transition into that. I think it would be good to get some closing statements from you both, and then I might pose a few questions to both of you from a very impartial point of view, and we can close it off.
Would you mind doing that before we do the closing statements?
Yeah, sure. One question I did have, and it comes from the olive oil paper that we were just looking at there. I know we went into mechanisms, and Tucker, you've mainly focused on oxidation. Matt, you didn't really bring a lot of different mechanistic data, but I'm interested with regards to seed oils and different mechanistic pathways other than oxidation. Have either of you come across data that looks at, well, how do seed oils affect inflammation? How do they affect the microbiota? How do they affect endothelial function? Lipids has come up. How do they affect insulin sensitivity? How do they affect blood pressure? Because I'm kind of thinking about zooming out here. What is the net effect of these seed oils on physiology other than the mechanisms that both of you have sort of brought to the table so far?
How many more hours do you have, Simon?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, this is gonna be yeah, and I'll just clarify on the point where you said I didn't really talk about mechanism. I mean, the one thing that I did bring up was ApoB or LDL concentration, or proxy for ApoB. I think that's, in my view, the primary mechanism. There may be others at play. At the end of the day, I think what matters is ultimately the outcomes, which is why that's where I place my focus. But as far as some of these other outcomes, like for inflammation overall, I mean, there's a meta-analysis. I think I sent this one to Tucker as well. There wasn't really association with any inflammatory markers. Now, in the dose response, those with, or might have been a subgroup analysis, or anyways, the highest intake of canola oil suggested a slight increase in CRP, which is one of the markers of inflammation. However, if you go into the specific studies on the high end there was still a reduction. It's an artifact of the way that they converted the findings from I believe it was median intakes to means to averages. So they had some people who were really high inflammation in the control group at baseline, so they reduced their inflammation more than the other group. And like, again, that's why I'm like, or Tucker's like, oh, Ben, how many hours do you have? Because I feel like we could talk about that forever too. But I see a bit of a reduction there. I believe there's some data on some other, mechanisms as well, but I don't think it's worth us spending however many hours at this point talking more and more about that. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. I think it's, take a couple minutes yourself and we can just move on.
Yeah, so Ramsden moved on from heart disease to migraines, and he did a targeted intervention lowering specifically linoleic acid, and also one lowering linoleic acid and increasing omega-3 fats, and showed clinically significant benefits in an inflammatory condition. So we have clear evidence through that one paper that reducing omega-6 fats can reduce inflammation. And, it was a really fascinating paper for a variety of reasons, but the main one was that the dietary intervention was more successful than the drugs used to treat migraine. So, ox-LDL is a well-described in the literature source of inflammation. Just hordes of papers on that particular topic, especially as regards cardiovascular disease. The standard the standard protocol for inducing insulin resistance in humans is to inject them with soybean oil. So, yeah. As there's a lot going on, and a lot of that ties back into this stuff. I mean, if you give monkeys an antibody against ox-LDL, and it lowers their insulin resistance. So, there's a lot going on beyond just this.
Let me ask this question in another way.
I think we both pretty successfully managed to stay on topic on this debate, though.
I'm going to ask this question to both of you. So for Tucker, are there any mechanisms whereby you see seed oils being beneficial? And Matt, are there any mechanisms where you see seed oils as being harmful or deleterious?
There are isolated conditions where they do seem to be beneficial. For instance, heart failure. Heart failure is associated with mitochondrial breakdown, and the mechanism for that is the omega-6 fats in the mitochondria getting oxidized. Replacing them with more omega-6 fats allows the body to replace the damaged fats with undamaged fats. So, I mean, there are some specific cases where, they do show benefit. I think the totality of the evidence is not really there for anything other than specific cases where they do show, specific edge cases like that where they're showing benefits.
Okay. And yeah, for me, I think one of the ones that, can't really go without mentioning is when we look at any kind of oil, really, they're incredibly calorically dense, right? It's like pure fat. It can be super calorically dense. When, if replacing more, say, fiber-rich foods, lower calorie density with vegetable oils, it is entirely possible they can contribute to something like weight gain. In the cases of some people, I have some athlete, friends in that who have a difficult time eating enough calories, especially on a more plant-based diet, where it's actually beneficial in that sense. But for someone who's maybe trying to lose weight, keep excess weight off, then it can be detrimental in that sense as well. So I think that would be one of the kind of simpler ones to just mention.
Okay, and my final question before your closing statements is to both of you, and that is whether or not anything today changed your position at all in any way, shape, or form, or at least gave you something to go away and think about a little bit further.
I mean, I would say my overall position hasn't shifted here. I mean, I don't think Tucker's has either. But at the same time, I think he raised some points that maybe I hadn't considered. There were, regardless of how important I think these mechanisms are when we have outcome-based data, I think they're interesting. They're interesting to learn a little bit more about, potentially learn a bit more about some of the pathways there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't think it shifted the needle for me as far as the effect that vegetable oil consumption would have on our overall health or specific to cardiac outcomes, as the topic of the debate kind of states.
Matt did an excellent job of assembling a body of evidence to support his position. Almost none of it was new to me, so it didn't move the needle for me.
Okay. And I do have one other one, and that is if you could be in charge of designing a study, setting up a study that would bring greater clarity to this topic, what would that trial look like?
Well, you'd have to do it in animals for starters. And I would want to see, there are a bunch of different papers looking at isolated or semi-isolated fatty acids in the diet and the effect on various factors. There are clear signals there for harms from omega-6 fats, but it's often it's just one or two fats and they're not looking at a spectrum of fats. I mentioned before a study where they looked at 3 different macronutrients and they varied the ratios of all the macronutrients to determine the effects on obesity. I'd like to see somebody do something like that with different fatty acids, the natural spectrum of fatty acids that would be included in a natural diet, and see if we can tease out what the effects are, because there are clearly confounders. I mean, as we've discussed here, omega-3 fats are a confounder for omega-6 fats and vice versa, and we need to, in order to have good dietary recommendations, we need to understand what those interactions are, because the dietary guidelines are lacking when it comes to the omega fats and their effects on health. It's not accurately reflected in the recommendations, I think.
Okay, and honestly, I would like to see, this will never be done nowadays, but I'd like to see a similar trial to the LA Veterans trial, but with 3 groups. I would love to see one where one group got olive oil in the same way that the intervention group got the vegetable oil. So you'd have the control group with the saturated fat-rich foods, you'd have one with the olive oil, and then you'd have one with the vegetable oils that are higher in polyunsaturated fats, lower in monounsaturated fats. I think it would just be really interesting because, at least across the epidemiology, we don't really see much of a difference between olive and vegetable oil. So teasing that out in a long-term trial.
Rose corn oil did that.
Yeah, and I mean, but it was just a really small trial overall. There weren't any statistically significant findings. If anything, olive oil also trended towards harm. Well, for the outcomes that we're talking about, of course, yeah. And even olive oil ended up on the side of potentially a little bit of harm relative, but I think it's largely due to just being underpowered and some other issues.
Let's not get back into to the debate.
On, Tucker.
No, but it sounds like we're both on this. It sounds like we're both on the same page there. That there's a lot lacking in the existing body of evidence, and it would be nice to see some more of the interactions of these different fats to help us get a better idea of what's going on.
I'm going to be greedy here. Yeah, Matt, you can answer that.
Sorry, I didn't. I don't know what the question was.
No, I was just observing that we seem to be on the same page. That it would be good if we had more evidence looking at the interactions of these different fats.
Specific to outcomes, in my opinion. But yes, I agree. Seeing the differetrances would be good.
I'm going to be greedy and ask one more question.
You said last question twice now.
I quite like getting you guys out of the debate mindset. Yeah. I think it's refreshing to finish this way. But last question, is there a chance that your position is wrong?
I think there is always a chance that your position on essentially anything could be wrong. Now, for me to change my view, I would need to be shown that my the data I presented or my position, which we can say related to the evidence hierarchy, is systematically false, and that the data presented otherwise is free from the same shortcomings or similar or even worse shortcomings than the data I've presented. If that were the case, I have no problem changing my view. And so that's kind of how I'd answer that.
Yeah, every time I read a paper, I get butterflies in my stomach thinking that it might prove me wrong. Going through Matt's series of papers was a painful exercise.
I thought you saw them already.
Well, I'd seen most of them, but not all of them. And there were a couple of interesting ones in there. So this was a useful exercise that way. Nothing to move the needle. But yeah, it's, if you're not willing to be proven wrong, you're not a serious person. And I got into this whole thing through basically being proven wrong, doing something that I thought, I hated diet stuff growing up, and I watched my mother yo-yo on Weight Watchers, and I thought the whole thing was bogus until I saw huge health benefits myself, and had to do a 180 on a couple of things. It's just sort of totally off topic, but I'm super gluten sensitive. And when I initially heard the proposal that wheat could be bad for you, I thought it was bogus. And, it wasn't bogus for me. It totally transformed my life. So yeah, it's a painful process to go through sometimes, but you're not serious if you're not willing to be open to the evidence.
Okay, great. And I think it is worth reiterating to everyone that you too may come at things differently, but you do agree on the fact that ultra-processed foods are probably not a great addition to the diet, and they do make up 60% of the average person's calories. So you agree on more than what you disagree on when we look at it like that. I might hand over to Tucker first to do his closing statement, given Matt went first at the start, and then Matt, you can jump in.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so as I think I got across in this, the problem with the modern American diet, in my opinion, is that it's a high linoleic, low omega-3 diet. And the studies that we've looked at today that look at that intervention tend to show harm, and they don't tend to show benefit. And to the extent that you can lower omega-6 and raise omega-3, that's when they start to show benefit. Seed oils specifically tend to be on that end of the spectrum, the high linoleic, low omega-3. And, the meta-analyses that we went over, there's very little evidence to show benefit from these interventions. And what little bit of evidence there is tends to show harm from these interventions. So after several decades of research, I think it's unreasonable to claim that there's going to be a big benefit from upping your consumption of linoleic acid in pursuit of the prevention of heart disease, but definitely do stop smoking.
Another thing we agree on. So I guess I'll take it away. I think ultimately, there's always going to be conflicting evidence, of course, on either side, and we can find the same for smoking too. But the thing is, when it comes to the trials on vegetable oil consumption as a whole, so not isolating to specifically one type of fatty acid over the other, but actual oils, soybean, corn, cottonseed, etc. We see that there is benefit, whether it's generally in that direction of benefit, whether it is a significant benefit, or in the trial that, as I've outlined, I think is best suited to answer the question, being benefit. I think it's pretty convincing data. And sure, we can look at some of the studies like Sydney Diet Heart and MCE as showing us harm from specifically linoleic acid, but they were also the ones that use a lot more margarine. And of course, in my view, that could very well be trans fat compounding. Obviously, we disagree there, and people, I'm sure, have heard that by now. But basically, when we look at the evidence from dietary intake in RCTs, dietary intake in cohorts, biomarkers of intake, Mendelian randomization, as I outlined at the beginning, we do see a consistent direction of effect, whether or not these are all statistically significant. And so I think that the data as it sits right now is pretty compelling that seed oil consumption overall is beneficial.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Tucker. Thank you, Matt. There's not going to be any comments from my end here in terms of my view on this topic. I think the fairest approach within this episode is to let the listener come to their own view without my influence. I would, however, like to close this out. Do you want to say something, Tucker?
Did your needle move at all?
Did my needle move at all?
And you don't have to say which direction. I'm just curious.
All I'll say is that I appreciate the complexity within this topic, and there is a lot of nuance, and I think both of you did a good job of covering that, but I'll leave it there because I don't want to sway people.
And I just want to comment really quick that I think, Simon, you did a really good job as a mod. I mean, I don't know if Tucker has any, I think
you did
a great job.
You did an excellent job, and you were an excellent opponent, Matt. Thank you very much to both of you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Tucker.
Thank you, guys. Finally, I do want to just ask those who leave comments on YouTube, as this will be on YouTube, please, I know that the whole diet wars can get a little heated. Please refrain from any personal attacks. Feel free to comment on the claims or the studies, but let's try and keep things respectful despite any differences that we may have. And with that, gents, I think we did it. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for this episode and your interest in science-based conversation. I hope you enjoyed it and found the information covered interesting and instructive. If you did and you'd like to show your support for the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can stay up to date with new episodes and watch them in video format. Yes, the full-length videos. Please also consider subscribing to the show on the Spotify and/or Apple Podcast app, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. You can also leave a review on Apple or Spotify. Again, a great way to support the show and make our content more discoverable for others to enjoy and learn from. If you have any comments about the episodes, suggestions for future episodes, including guests you'd like to see on the show, or questions that you'd like to have answered, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. I myself and my team will take note of these comments when planning future episodes. Finally, the best way to support the show and receive discounts on products we love is by checking out our sponsors at theproof.com/friends. Enjoy your week, stay well, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.